A 7-year-old secret buried under a dead pine tree, a biker badge that should have never surfaced, and a child standing alone in the mist, holding the one piece of evidence that could get him killed before morning. Gideon Cross hadn't spoken his best friend's name out loud in 7 years. Not once. Not to the brothers. Not to himself. Because saying it meant admitting Elias Boone was gone, and Gideon wasn't ready for that truth. But when an 11-year-old boy pulled a rusted metal badge from his backpack and whispered, "This was hidden in the forest," Gideon's war started all over again. If you're ready for this ride, hit that like button, drop your city in the comments, and stay until the very end. This one doesn't let go. The fog came down like a funeral shroud every October across the ridgeline of Black Ridge National Forest. Not the soft kind that poets wrote about. This was mountain fog. Cold, wet, heavy enough to press against a man's chest and make his lungs work harder than they should. The kind that swallowed sound. The kind that turned familiar roads into hostile territory. Gideon Cross had been riding through it for 7 years straight. Same date, same route. Same stretch of cracked 2-lane blacktop that wound from the flatlands up through the pines until the air turned sharp and thin and the temperature dropped 15 degrees in half a mile. He never told anyone he was going, never asked for company, just rolled his Harley Road King out of the garage before dawn, strapped his cut over 3 layers of thermal clothing, and disappeared into the mountains like a man paying a debt nobody asked him to carry. The bike beneath him was older than the grief. A 2004 model with more miles than most commercial trucks, rebuilt twice from the frame up, the engine retuned so many times that the exhaust note had become something personal, a low, shuddering growl that echoed off granite walls and scattered birds from the tree line. He could feel every crack in the asphalt through the handlebars, every frost heave, every patch of gravel that the county never bothered to sweep because nobody lived up here anymore. Nobody except ghosts. He downshifted into a long curve, and the fog thinned just enough to show the edge of the ravine dropping away to his left. 200 feet of nothing. Pine tops poking through the white like fingers reaching for something they'd never touch. The guardrail had rusted out years ago. Someone had strung orange reflectors along wooden posts, but half of them were missing now, torn away by winter storms or stolen by teenagers who didn't understand what a mountain road could do to a man at 60 miles an hour. Gideon understood. He'd carried the body bags to prove it. 12 years in the Army, 3 combat deployments. 2 Purple Hearts he kept in a coffee can under his bathroom sink because putting them on display felt like bragging about surviving when better men hadn't. He'd come home from his last tour with a shattered left knee, a ringing in his ears that never fully stopped, and the kind of silence inside his chest that no amount of noise could fill. The Iron Vulture's motorcycle brotherhood hadn't saved him. He didn't believe in salvation, and he didn't trust anyone who claimed to offer it. But the brotherhood had given him something simpler and more honest than salvation. A seat at a table where nobody asked him to explain why he woke up at 3 in the morning and couldn't go back to sleep. A garage where the sound of wrenches and compressors drowned out whatever was playing on a repeat inside his skull. A road that always went somewhere, even when everything else felt like standing still. Elias Boone had been the one to bring him in. Gideon's throat tightened the way it always did when the name surfaced uninvited. He swallowed against it, focused on the road, felt the cold air cutting through the gap between his collar and the bottom edge of his helmet. The pain in his left knee had started up around mile 40, a deep, wet ache that settled into the joint like rainwater into old wood. He ignored it the way he ignored everything that hurt, by riding harder. Elias had been his spotter in Afghanistan, 2 tours together, 2 men who learned to breathe in sync, to read each other's silence, to trust that the other one would be exactly where he needed to be when everything went sideways. After discharge, Elias had gone home to the mountains, and Gideon had gone home to nothing. A rented room above a hardware store, a bottle that emptied faster than it should have, a phone that didn't ring. Then one night Elias showed up, unannounced, leather jacket, motorcycle boots, grease under his fingernails, and road dust on his face. He'd ridden 11 hours straight to knock on Gideon's door and say 4 words. "You're coming with me." No argument, no explanation, just the absolute certainty of a man who'd already decided the outcome before the conversation started. That was Elias. And 7 years ago this month, Elias Boone rode into Black Ridge National Forest for a charity trail event organized by the Brotherhood and never came back. The search lasted 19 days. Helicopters, dogs, volunteer teams from 6 counties. They found his motorcycle on a fire access road, leaned against a tree with the keys still in the ignition and the fuel tank half full. No blood, no signs of struggle, no tracks leading away, just a machine waiting for a rider who never returned. The official conclusion was exposure. A man wandered off the trail, got disoriented in the fog, fell into one of the hundreds of unmarked ravines that cut through the mountain like open wounds. The body would surface eventually, they said. These mountains always gave back what they took. 7 years later, the mountains had given back nothing. Gideon pulled off the road at a gravel turnout that overlooked the valley. He killed the engine and sat in the silence, letting it press against him like something physical. The fog moved through the pines below in slow waves. Somewhere far off, a raven called once and didn't call again. He pulled off his gloves and flexed his fingers. They were stiff from the cold and from gripping the bars too hard for too long, a habit he'd never broken. His knuckles were scarred, some from combat, some from barroom disagreements, one from punching a bathroom mirror 3 months after Elias disappeared because the face staring back at him looked like a man who'd given up. He hadn't given up. He'd just stopped knowing what to do next. The sound came from the tree line, a branch snapping, then another, not the random crack of wind or wildlife, something deliberate. A rhythm. Footsteps. Gideon's hand moved to his belt before his conscious mind registered the threat assessment. 12 years of training didn't ask permission. His fingers found the leather sheath of his fixed-blade knife and stayed there, loose, ready. A shape emerged from the fog, small, thin, moving with the careful, uneven steps of someone navigating terrain they knew well but were afraid of anyway. A boy, 11, maybe 12 years old, wearing a flannel shirt 2 sizes too big, rubber boots caked with mud, and a backpack that hung off one shoulder like it was too heavy for his frame. His hair was dark and unwashed, pushed to one side. His face was pale with cold, and his eyes, when they finally lifted to meet Gideon's, held the unmistakable wariness of a child who'd learned early that adults were not automatically safe. Gideon recognized that look. He'd seen it in the mirror when he was roughly the same age. "You lost?" Gideon asked. His voice came out rougher than he intended. 7 hours of riding in cold air did that. The boy stopped at the edge of the gravel, 10 feet of open space between them. His eyes moved from Gideon's face to the motorcycle to the patches on his cut and back to his face. Reading, calculating, deciding. "No," the boy said quietly. "I live up here." "Up here where?" "Ranger cabin, past the second fire road." Gideon knew the place. An old Forest Service station that had been decommissioned 15 years ago. Someone had told him a retired ranger still lived out there. Off-grid, no phone, no internet, no interest in the rest of the world. "Your grandfather," Gideon said. Not a question. The boy nodded. Silence settled between them. The fog thickened. Somewhere in the valley, an engine fired up. Chainsaw or generator, impossible to tell from this distance. "What's your name?" Gideon asked. "Owen." "Owen what?" "Mercer." The boy shifted his weight. His hand went to the strap of his backpack and tightened on it, and Gideon noticed the movement wasn't casual. It was protective, the way a soldier held a weapon he wasn't supposed to have. "Do you need something, Owen?" The boy's jaw tightened. His eyes dropped to the ground, then came back up. There was a fight happening behind that face, the kind of fight between wanting to trust and knowing better. "I found something," Owen said. Gideon waited. He'd learned a long time ago that silence pulled more truth out of people than questions ever could. Owen reached into his backpack with both hands, slowly, the way someone handles a thing they know is important but don't fully understand. He pulled out a cloth bundle, an old dish towel wrapped around something hard and flat. He unwrapped it with careful fingers. The metal caught what little light filtered through the fog. Gideon stopped breathing. It was a badge. Iron Vulture's issue. Hand-forged steel with the Brotherhood sigil stamped deep into the face. A vulture with spread wings clutching a crescent moon. Below the sigil, a name engraved in block letters that had been worn by weather and time, but were still legible. Boone. And underneath, the road name. Ghost Rider. The ringing in Gideon's ears surged. His vision narrowed. He felt his heartbeat in his temples, in his throat, behind his eyes. Every nerve ending in his body fired at once and then went cold, the way the world goes cold in the half-second before an IED detonates and training takes over because the conscious mind has already shut down. "Where did you find this?" His voice was barely a whisper. Owen flinched at the change in Gideon's tone, but held his ground. "There's an old trail, past the firewatch station. A big pine fell down after the last storm, and the roots pulled up a bunch of dirt. This was underneath, in a hole. Like somebody put it there. Like somebody buried it. Like somebody wanted it to disappear." Gideon reached out and took the badge. The weight of it hit him harder than he expected. Not the physical weight, but the memory weight. He'd watched Elias forge this badge himself in the Brotherhood shop, hammering the steel at 2 a.m, with the radio playing old country songs and the wood stove throwing shadows across the concrete floor. Every Iron Vulture made his own badge. It was tradition. The badge stayed with your cut until you died or walked away from the Brotherhood. Elias had done neither. The badge had been torn from him. "Did you tell anyone else about this?" Gideon asked. "My grandfather." "What did he say?" Owen's face changed. Something dark passed through his expression. Not fear exactly, but something close to it. Something older. "He said to put it back and forget about it." "But you didn't." "No." "Why not?" The boy looked at the badge in Gideon's hands, then back up at his face. "Because somebody hid it on purpose, and that means somebody wanted it not to be found. And if somebody wanted it not to be found—" He stopped. His voice had started to shake and he was fighting it. "Then maybe somebody needs to find it." Gideon stared at the child standing alone in the mountain fog, holding on to reasoning that most adults would never reach. A boy who lived in isolation with a grandfather who told him to bury what he'd found, and instead walked 2 miles through wilderness to hand it to a stranger on a motorcycle because he understood instinctively that silence was the same thing as complicity. The badge was cold in Gideon's palm, the engraving pressed into his skin like a brand. He closed his fist around it. "Get on," he said. Owen blinked. "What?" "I'm taking you home, then I'm coming back, and I need you to show me exactly where you found this." The ride to the ranger cabin took 12 minutes along a fire road that hadn't been graded in years. Gideon kept the speed down, one arm braced, his body absorbing the shocks so the boy behind him wouldn't have to. Owen held onto the sissy bar with both hands and didn't say a word the entire ride. The cabin sat in a clearing surrounded by Douglas fir so tall their tops disappeared into the fog. The structure was old, hand-hewn logs, a tin roof patched with mismatched metal, a porch that sagged on one side under the weight of firewood stacked 4 feet high. Smoke curled from a rusted stovepipe. A truck that hadn't moved in years sat on flat tires near a woodshed. An old man stood on the porch. He was tall and lean in the way that mountain living makes a person, stripped down to bone and sinew, no excess, no softness. His hair was white, pulled back under a canvas cap. His hands rested at his sides, but his shoulders were tight. He'd heard the motorcycle. He'd been waiting. His eyes went to Owen first, then to Gideon, then to the patches on Gideon's cut. "Owen," the old man said. "Inside. Grandpa, inside." The boy climbed off the motorcycle and walked toward the cabin, but he stopped at the bottom of the porch steps and looked back at Gideon with an expression that said everything his mouth couldn't. "Don't leave." Gideon gave him the smallest nod. Owen went inside. The old man came down the steps slowly, each footfall deliberate, the kind of movement that said he'd been managing pain for a long time and had stopped noticing it. Hector Mercer? Gideon asked. Who's asking? Gideon Cross, Iron Vultures. The old man's jaw muscles tightened. I know what the patches mean. Then you know why I'm here. I told the boy to put it back. He didn't. I can see that. Hector's eyes moved to Gideon's closed fist, the one still holding the badge. You need to leave that alone. Can't do that. Then you're a fool. Gideon let the word hang in the air. He'd been called worse by better men. The man who carried this badge was my brother, Gideon said. Not by blood, by war, by road, by every promise two men can make to each other that doesn't require paperwork. He disappeared 7 years ago, and nobody gave me an answer I could live with. Your grandson just handed me the first honest piece of evidence I've seen since the day they found his motorcycle sitting on a fire road with the keys still in it. He opened his fist and held the badge up so the old man could see it clearly. Somebody buried this. Somebody didn't want it found. And your grandson found it anyway. So I'm asking you, respectfully, to tell me what you know. Hector Mercer stared at the badge for a long time. The fog moved around them both. The only sound was the stovepipe ticking as the fire inside the cabin breathed. I don't know anything, Hector finally said. That's not what your face is telling me. The old man's expression hardened. My face is telling you to get on your motorcycle and ride back down that mountain and never come back. That's what my face is telling you. Why? Because 7 years ago, someone went looking for answers in these woods, and he never came home. Hector's voice dropped to something barely above a whisper. You want to be number 2? The question sat between them like a loaded weapon. Gideon put the badge in his jacket pocket, zipped it shut, and swung his leg back over the motorcycle. I'll be back tomorrow, he said, with brothers, and we'll need Owen to show us the spot. You stay away from my grandson. Mr. Mercer. Gideon's voice was steady, but there was iron underneath it. The kind that didn't come from anger. It came from the absolute certainty that walking away was not an option. Whoever buried that badge already knows it's been found. There were fresh tracks around that area, your grandson told me, which means someone has been back to check on it. And if they've been checking on it, they'll figure out real soon that it's missing. And when they do, the first place they'll come looking is the only occupied cabin within 5 miles of that spot. The color drained from Hector Mercer's face. Your grandson isn't in danger because of me, Gideon said quietly. He's in danger because the truth came up out of the ground, and the men who put it there are going to want it back. He started the engine. The sound shattered the stillness and echoed off the mountains. Tomorrow, Gideon said, early. He rode down the fire road without looking back. The clubhouse of the Iron Vultures sat in an industrial lot on the eastern edge of Millhaven, a town that existed because the lumber mill existed and had been slowly dying since the mill shut down 14 years ago. The building was a former machine shop, corrugated steel walls, concrete floor, a roll-up garage door wide enough for 3 bikes side by side. Inside smelled of motor oil, stale coffee, welding flux, and the permanent ghost of 10,000 cigarettes smoked during 10,000 late-night conversations about things civilians would never understand. Gideon arrived after dark. 4 motorcycles were already lined up outside. He could hear voices through the wall, low, unhurried, the cadence of men who didn't need to fill silence with noise. He walked in, and the talking stopped. 4 men at a long wooden table, beer bottles, an ashtray, a spread of playing cards nobody was actually playing. The overhead fluorescent buzzed with the particular frequency that announced it would die within the week. Deacon Hale sat at the head of the table, chapter president, 53 years old. Silver beard trimmed close, arms covered in tattoos that mapped his military service like a timeline you could read if you knew the language. He'd done 18 years in the Marine Corps, the last 6 of which he rarely talked about. His eyes were pale blue and absolutely still. You look like hell, Deacon said. I was up on the ridge. Today's the day. Yeah. Nobody said anything else about it. They didn't need to. Every man in this room had his own anniversary, his own date on the calendar that hit different from every other date. They understood the geography of grief. You didn't cross into another man's territory uninvited. Gideon reached into his jacket and set the badge on the table. The sound it made when it hit the wood was small and final, like a round being chambered. Deacon leaned forward. His expression didn't change, but the stillness in his body shifted. The kind of shift that happens when a man who has spent his entire adult life assessing threats recognizes one. He picked up the badge, turned it over, read the name. "Where?" Deacon said. "Black Ridge, under a fallen pine. An 11-year-old boy found it. The rain exposed it." "The badge was buried?" "Deliberately." "And the boy?" "Lives up there with his grandfather, former ranger, name's Mercer. The old man told the kid to put it back and forget about it. The kid didn't listen." Deacon set the badge down. Every man at the table was staring at it now. The fluorescent light hummed. Somewhere in the back of the building, a compressor kicked on and then shut off. "Elias never took his badge off his cut," said a voice from the far end of the table. Cal Briscoe, the Brotherhood's road captain. A former Army medic who still carried a field kit in his saddlebag because old habits were the only habits worth keeping. His face was lean and weathered, split by a scar that ran from his left ear to his jawline, a souvenir from a roadside bomb that killed 2 men standing next to him and left him standing. "Not once. I watched him sleep with his cut on during charity runs. That badge was part of his body." "Which means somebody took it off him," said another voice. Reno Vasquez, young, 29. The newest full-patch member, but combat-tested, 2 tours in a unit whose designation was still classified. He had the build of a middleweight boxer and the quiet intensity of a man who processed the world through threat assessment before he processed it through anything else. The 4th man hadn't spoken. Silas Kane, the oldest member at the table, 61, former Green Beret. He sat with his arms crossed, his eyes on the badge, his jaw working slowly on nothing. Silas had been the one who organized the 19-day search for Elias. He'd been the last man to leave the mountain, and he'd been the one who, at the memorial service, stood at the podium for 45 seconds without saying a word before walking away because the words he had weren't the kind you said out loud. "Someone buried it because it connected to something," Gideon said, "and someone has been going back to check on it. The kid said there were fresh tracks near the spot, recent, within the last few weeks." "How recent?" Deacon asked. "Recent enough that whoever it is will notice the badge is gone." Silence. Deacon looked around the table. No one spoke, but the answer was already in the room. It had been in the room from the moment the badge hit the table. "Tomorrow," Deacon said. "First light. We ride up together. The boy shows us the spot. We see what else the mountain gives up." He looked at Gideon. "And Gideon, if this goes where I think it goes, there's no putting it back in the ground." "I know." "Do you?" "Because I'm not talking about the badge. I'm talking about what happens when you start pulling threads that somebody spent 7 years tying down. I'm talking about the kind of trouble that doesn't come with a warning." Gideon met Deacon's eyes. The buzzing fluorescent cast hard shadows under both men's brows, making their faces look carved from the same unforgiving stone. "Elias pulled me out of a hole I was never going to climb out of on my own," Gideon said. "He rode 11 hours through the night to knock on my door because he decided I was worth saving. I don't know what happened to him in those mountains, but I know somebody does, and I know that badge didn't bury itself." He picked it up from the table and held it in his closed fist, the metal edges pressing into the calluses of his palm like a promise being renewed. "I owed him a debt I never got to pay. This is the payment." Deacon studied him for a long moment. Then he nodded once, not with enthusiasm, not with reluctance, but with the grim acceptance of a man who had led other men into dark places before and knew exactly what it cost. "First light," Deacon repeated. "Everybody rides." The meeting broke up without ceremony. Men drained their bottles, stubbed out cigarettes, pulled on jackets. No speeches, no rallying cries. That wasn't how it worked. The decision was made the moment Gideon put the badge on the table. Everything after was logistics. Gideon was the last one out. He stood in the parking lot under a sky choked with low clouds, the orange glow of Millhaven's dying streetlights casting everything in the color of rust. His motorcycle ticked as the engine cooled. The air smelled of wet concrete and diesel from the trucking depot across the road. He pulled out the badge and looked at it one more time. Elias's hands had made this. The hammer marks were still visible along the edges, irregular, human, imperfect, the way real things always were. 7 years of silence. 7 years of riding to the mountain and coming back empty. And now a boy had walked out of the fog carrying the one thing that was never supposed to surface. Gideon zipped the badge back into his pocket and swung onto the bike. The engine caught on the first kick, the exhaust rumbling through the empty industrial lot like distant thunder. As he pulled onto the highway, his phone buzzed in his vest pocket. A text from a number he didn't recognize. 4 words. Put it back. Gideon stared at the screen. The highway stretched ahead into darkness. The fog was already rolling down from the mountains, reaching for the flatlands like something alive, something hungry, something that had kept a secret for 7 years and wasn't ready to let it go. Someone already knew. Someone was watching. And by tomorrow morning, when 5 iron vultures rode into Black Ridge National Forest with a dead man's badge and an 11-year-old guide, the mountain would know they were coming. The only question was whether the mountain would let them leave. They rode out at 5:14 in the morning, before the sun had any chance of clearing the eastern ridge. 5 machines in staggered formation, headlights cutting through fog so thick the beams stopped dead 6 feet ahead, like the air itself refused to let them pass. Deacon led. Gideon rode second. Cal, Reno, and Silas filled the line behind them. Engines throttled low, the combined rumble rolling across the empty highway like something ancient waking up beneath the asphalt. Nobody spoke through the Bluetooth channel. There was nothing to say that the road wasn't already saying. Gideon hadn't slept. He'd sat on the edge of his bed in the apartment above the old barbershop on Millhaven's east side, staring at the phone screen until the 4 words burned into his retinas. Put it back. He'd run the number, prepaid, untraceable. The kind of phone you bought at a gas station counter and threw in a ditch after one use. Whoever sent it knew what they were doing. Whoever sent it knew about the badge within hours of Owen pulling it out of the ground. That meant someone was watching the forest. That meant someone had been watching the forest for 7 years. The thought sat in his stomach like swallowed glass. They turned off the highway onto the county road that climbed toward Black Ridge. The pavement deteriorated immediately. Crack, dot slit, frost, heaved, patched with tar that had already crumbled. The trees closed in on both sides, Douglas fir and western red cedar pressing against the shoulders like walls built to keep people out. The temperature dropped. Gideon felt it in his knee first, then in his fingers, then in the scars across his left shoulder where shrapnel had torn through his body armor 9 years ago, in a valley whose name he'd trained himself to forget. The fire road turnoff appeared in Gideon's headlight like a wound in the tree line. He signaled. The formation slowed. One by one, they turned onto the unpaved track, tires biting into gravel and loose dirt, suspension working hard against ruts that could swallow a front wheel if you weren't paying attention. The ranger cabin materialized out of the fog exactly as it had the day before. Smoke from the stovepipe, the dead truck on flat tires, firewood stacked on the sagging porch. But something was different. Hector Mercer was standing in the yard, not on the porch, in the yard, wearing a heavy canvas jacket, boots laced tight, and a hunting rifle cradled in the crook of his arm, not pointed at anything, just present, the way a man holds a weapon when he wants you to know the conversation has terms. Deacon killed his engine first. The others followed. The silence that fell was absolute. No wind, no birds, no water. Just fog and cold air and 5 men sitting on motorcycles facing one old man with a rifle and a face made of granite. "Mr. Mercer," Deacon said, swinging his leg over and standing. His voice was measured, respectful. The voice of a man who understood that this was Hector's ground and protocol mattered even when time didn't. "I count 5, Hector said. "The boy told me one. Things changed overnight." Things always change when people start digging where they shouldn't. Gideon dismounted but stayed by his bike. He could feel the tension radiating off Hector like heat from a stove. Not aggression, but something deeper. Fear compressed so tightly it had turned into defiance. "We're not here to cause trouble for you or Owen," Gideon said. "You're trouble whether you mean to be or not." Hector's eyes moved across the line of bikers, reading patches, reading faces, reading the accumulated weight of combat experience and hard living that hung off these men like second skins. "I spent 32 years in this forest. I know every trail, every ridge, every drainage. And I know what happens when people start asking questions about things that happened up here." "What happens?" Deacon asked. Hector looked at him for a long time. The fog moved between them like something breathing. "People stop coming home." The front door of the cabin opened. Owen stepped out onto the porch, dressed in the same oversized flannel, the same mud-caked boots. His backpack was on his shoulders. His eyes found Gideon immediately and held there with an intensity that didn't belong on an 11-year-old face. "I told you to stay inside," Hector said without turning around. "I'm going with them." "Like hell you are." "Grandpa." Owen came down the steps. His voice was quiet, but it didn't waver. "They can't find the spot without me. There's no trail marker. The tree fell across the creek drainage past the second switchback on the old Firewatch path. You know nobody goes up there." "I know nobody should go up there." "Then why did somebody bury something there?" The question landed like a stone dropped into still water. Hector's jaw tightened. His grip shifted on the rifle, not threatening, just reflexive. The grip of a man who'd been holding on to control for a very long time and could feel it starting to slip. Gideon stepped forward, slowly, the way you approach a wounded animal that might bolt or bite. "Hector," he said. First name. Deliberate. Closing the distance between stranger and something else. "I got a text last night. Anonymous. 4 words. Telling me to put the badge back. That means whoever buried it already knows it's been found. Which means they either have surveillance on the site or they have eyes on this cabin. Either way, the clock is running. And it's not running in Owen's favor." Hector's face changed. The defiance cracked. Underneath it was something raw and desperate. The face of a man who had spent years building walls around the only person he had left in the world and had just been told the walls weren't thick enough. "He's all I have," Hector said. The words came out stripped of everything except the truth. No anger, no posturing, just a grandfather standing in a foggy clearing with a rifle he probably hadn't fired in years, trying to keep the world from touching the one thing that still mattered. "I know," Gideon said. "That's why we're here." Hector looked at the bikers. 5 men, leather cuts patched with insignia that spoke a language he understood even if he'd never lived it. Brotherhood, service, sacrifice, the bonds forged in places where trust wasn't optional. It was survival. He lowered the rifle. "I'll come too," Hector said. "Owen leads. I walk behind him. Any sign of trouble, we turn back. No arguments." Deacon nodded. "Fair." They left the motorcycles at the cabin and went on foot. Owen moved through the forest like he'd been born in it, which, for all practical purposes, he had. He navigated by landmarks invisible to anyone who hadn't spent a childhood memorizing the language of this specific patch of wilderness. A bent tree, a lichen-covered boulder, a creek crossing where the water ran over flat stones arranged in a pattern that nature hadn't made. Gideon walked behind him, matching the boy's pace, his eyes scanning the terrain the way they'd scanned hostile ground in Afghanistan, quadrant by quadrant, near to far, looking for anomalies, things that didn't belong, patterns that were too regular, colors that didn't match the season. Behind him, the Brotherhood moved in silence. Cal had his medical kit. Reno carried a compact flashlight and a folding entrenching tool. Silas brought nothing except himself, which was more than enough. The man moved through rough terrain with the economy of someone who'd spent years doing it in places far more dangerous than this. Deacon walked beside Hector. The 2 men didn't speak, but there was an understanding between them. The mutual recognition of age, of service, of the weight that accumulates when you've spent decades being the one responsible for other people's safety. 28 minutes in, the forest changed. The trees grew thicker. The canopy closed overhead until what little light existed was filtered through layers of branches and fog into something gray and directionless. The trail narrowed to a deer path, then to nothing. Owen navigated by memory alone, ducking under deadfall, stepping over roots, never hesitating. Then he stopped. There. The fallen pine was massive, 4 feet in diameter at the base, 80 feet long from root ball to shattered crown. It had come down hard enough to tear a crater in the earth where the roots had ripped free, exposing a wound of dark soil, clay, and stone. Rain had been working the exposed ground for weeks, carving channels through the loose dirt, pulling layers apart. Owen pointed to a spot near the base of the root ball. Right there, the badge was in the dirt, about a foot down, wrapped in something plastic, I think. The plastic was mostly gone, but there were pieces. Gideon crouched beside the spot. The soil was loose and dark. He could see where Owen's small hands had dug, shallow impressions, finger-width grooves in the clay. But there were other marks too, older, deeper, tool marks, the straight-edge cuts of a shovel blade, not fresh but not 7 years old either. Somebody had been here, more than once. The layers told a story if you knew how to read them. The original burial, then subsequent visits, the soil disturbed and resettled multiple times over multiple years. "Reno," Gideon said. Reno moved forward with the entrenching tool and began working the soil methodically, not digging randomly, but excavating in careful horizontal planes the way you'd clear a site looking for ordnance. Slow, precise. Every shovelful examined before the next one moved. 6 inches down, metal, a belt buckle, iron vultures issue. Custom stamped with the same sigil as the badge. 12 inches down, fabric, burned. Fragments of riding gear, heavy-duty textile, synthetic fibers melted and fused by heat. The kind of damage you'd see on a jacket that had been thrown into a fire but pulled out before it was fully consumed. 18 inches, something else. Reno stopped digging. His face went flat. The medic's mask, the expression that appeared when what he was looking at required clinical distance. Gideon. Gideon leaned forward. Partially buried in the clay, sealed inside a vacuum bag that had survived the years better than anything else in the hole, was a motorcycle ignition assembly, wiring harness, ignition switch, starter relay, cut, not broken, cut with a tool, deliberately removed. "That's from his bike," Cal said from behind them. His voice was barely a whisper. "That's the ignition from Elias's bike." Gideon sat back on his heels. His chest felt like something was pressing on it from the inside. He breathed through his nose, slow and controlled, the way he'd been trained to breathe when everything around him was burning, and panic was a luxury he couldn't afford. They'd found Elias's motorcycle 7 years ago. Keys in the ignition. Engine cold. No visible damage. The official report said he'd simply stopped riding, parked the bike, and walked into the forest. But if the ignition assembly had been cut and removed, then the motorcycle had been staged. Someone had disabled the bike, stripped the parts that would show tool marks, buried them, and then replaced the ignition with an intact unit to make it look like the machine was simply abandoned. Elias hadn't walked into the forest. Elias had been taken. "Cal," Gideon said, and his voice sounded like it belonged to someone else. "When they found his bike during the search, who was first on scene?" Cal closed his eyes, thinking. "County Sheriff's Deputy. Donovan, I think. Rick Donovan. He was the one who called it in." "Where is Donovan now?" "Retired, 3 years ago. Lives in Granger, last I heard." "That's 40 minutes from here." Deacon stepped forward. He'd been watching everything without speaking, cataloging details the way a commander catalogs battlefield intelligence, waiting until the picture was clear enough to make decisions. "Before we talk to anyone outside this group," Deacon said, "we need to understand what we're looking at. Gideon, you found the badge. Now we've got burned gear, cut ignition components, and evidence of repeated site visits. This isn't a cold case someone forgot about. This is an active concealment operation. Someone has been managing this burial site for 7 years. Which means someone local, Silas said. It was the first time he'd spoken all morning. His voice was like gravel being crushed under a boot. Nobody drives up this mountain regularly without being noticed. Not unless they already have a reason to be here. Every head turned toward Hector Mercer. The old ranger stood at the edge of the excavation, his face the color of ash. The rifle hung from his shoulder, forgotten. His eyes were fixed on the burned fragments of riding gear, as if he were looking at something he'd been trying to outrun for a very long time. "Hector," Gideon said. "I didn't know," Hector said, his voice cracked on the second word. "I swear I didn't know what was buried there. But you knew something was wrong." Silence. "Hector." The old man's hands were shaking. He shoved them into his jacket pockets and looked away. At the trees, at the fog, at anything except the hole in the ground and the men surrounding it. 3 years after your friend disappeared, Hector said slowly, each word pulled out of him like a tooth, I found boot prints on the old Firewatch trail. Fresh, deep, someone carrying something heavy. I followed them to this area, but the rain had washed the tracks out before I could pinpoint the exact location. A week later, someone broke into my equipment shed. Didn't take anything. Just went through everything, like they were looking for something or sending a message. Did you report it? To who? Hector's voice rose. The nearest sheriff's substation is 45 miles away. I called the Forest Service district office. They said they'd send someone. Nobody came. I called again a month later. Different person. No record of my first call. I drove down to the office myself. The district supervisor looked me in the eye and told me I was seeing things. Told me isolation does that to older people. Told me maybe it was time I thought about moving closer to town. He pulled one trembling hand from his pocket and pointed at the hole. After that, I stopped calling. I reinforced the cabin. I taught Owen to stay close. And I told myself that whatever happened on this mountain was none of my business as long as it stayed away from us. It didn't stay away, Gideon said. No, it didn't. Owen was sitting on the fallen pine, his legs dangling, his face pale and tight, listening to everything, understanding more than anyone wanted him to. Gideon turned to Deacon. The district supervisor, Forest Service. 3 years after Elias disappeared, someone in that office buried a report about suspicious activity in the exact area where we're finding evidence. That's not negligence, that's participation. Deacon's jaw tightened. We need to find out who was running that district office. And we need to talk to Donovan, Gideon said, the deputy who found Elias's bike. He was first on scene. If the ignition was swapped, it either happened before Donovan arrived or Donovan missed it. And a county deputy who spent 20 years doing accident investigation doesn't miss tool marks on a motorcycle ignition. Unless he was told not to look, Reno said. The implication settled over the group like the fog settled over the mountain. Slow, cold, inescapable. Cal was bagging the recovered items with the methodical care of a man preserving evidence for a purpose he hadn't fully defined yet. Each piece sealed in a Ziploc from his medical kit, labeled with a marker in his precise clinical handwriting. Date, location, depth, description. He'd done this before, not in a forest, but in theater, processing casualty effects for families who'd never see the place where their son or husband or father died. There's more down there, Reno said quietly. He was still kneeling at the edge of the excavation, looking at something deeper in the clay. I can see the edge of something, larger. Not metal. Leave it, Deacon said. We don't have the right tools and we don't have the right authority. What we have is enough to know that this site needs a federal forensic team, not 5 men with a folding shovel. Federal means FBI, Gideon said. I know what it means. It means we hand this over and we lose control. We never had control. Deacon's voice was steady, but his eyes were hard. Gideon, I understand what you're feeling. Every man here understands it. But we're standing on what might be a crime scene connected to the murder of a brother. And if we contaminate it by digging further, everything we've found becomes inadmissible. Since when do you trust the system? I don't trust the system. I trust evidence. And right now, evidence is the only weapon we have. The argument hung in the cold air between them. two men. Brothers in a covenant older and more binding than any legal structure. One pulled by grief toward action, the other held by experience in the space where patience wasn't weakness. It was the only strategy that won wars fought against enemies with institutional power. Gideon looked at the badge in his pocket, then at the items Cal was bagging, then at Owen sitting on the fallen tree, watching everything with eyes too old for his face. "Fine," Gideon said. "We document. We preserve. We don't dig further. But I'm talking to Donovan today, alone." "Not alone," Silas said. "Silas, not alone." The old Green Beret's voice left no room for discussion. "I sat on that podium at Elias's memorial, and I couldn't find the words. Couldn't find a single one. You know what that does to a man? 7 years of not having the words? You're not going to Donovan alone, because I need to hear what he says with my own ears. I need that." The raw honesty of it cracked something open in the group. For a moment there was nothing between these men except the shared weight of what they carried. The accumulated loss, the unanswered questions, the specific kind of pain that comes from loving someone who vanished without giving you the chance to say the thing you never said. Gideon nodded. "Okay. Silas rides with me. The rest stay here, secure the site, and get Owen and Hector back to the cabin." They reburied the excavation loosely, enough to conceal it from a casual observer, not enough to destroy the stratigraphy for a real forensic team. Cal photographed everything with his phone. Reno marked GPS coordinates. Deacon walked the perimeter, reading the ground, noting secondary trails and drainage patterns that might indicate other burial locations. Nobody said what everyone was thinking. If this was a graveyard, Elias might not be the only one in it. The ride to Granger took 37 minutes on roads that wound through dying timber towns and shuttered sawmill communities where the only open businesses were gas stations and liquor stores. Gideon led. Silas rode his 2008 Electra Glide with the quiet confidence of a man who'd been on 2 wheels longer than most people had been alive. Neither of them spoke through the Bluetooth. The wind was enough conversation. Rick Donovan lived in a single-story house at the end of a gravel road outside Granger, white paint peeling, gutters sagging, a carport sheltering a late-model sedan, and a boat that hadn't seen water in years. The yard was neat despite the house's decay. Trimmed grass, a flagpole flying a faded American flag, a garden bed along the front that someone still tended. Gideon parked at the curb. Silas pulled in behind him. They dismounted, removed helmets, and walked up the concrete path to the front door. Gideon's knee screamed on every step, but his face showed nothing. You didn't limp in front of people you were about to interrogate. He knocked. Footsteps inside, slow. A chain rattled. The door opened 4 inches, stopped by a security chain that was new. The brass was still bright, the screws shiny against old wood. A face appeared in the gap. Male, late 50s, thin. The hollowed-out look of a man who'd been losing weight he couldn't afford to lose. His eyes moved from Gideon to Silas to the cuts they wore and back to Gideon. "Rick Donovan? Who's asking?" "Gideon Cross. Iron Vultures." The face behind the chain went pale. Not the gradual pale of surprise. The instant, blood-leaving the skin pale of a man who has been waiting for this knock for years and praying it would never come. "I don't have anything to say to you." "Then just listen." "I'm retired." "So is the man we're here about." Donovan's eyes darted past them, scanning the street, the neighboring houses, the tree line beyond the road, looking for something, or looking for someone. "I can't help you," he said. His voice was thin, strained, the voice of a man speaking through a throat that had been squeezed by something invisible for a very long time. Gideon held up the badge. Donovan stared at it through the 4-inch gap in the door. His face didn't change because there was nothing left to change. It was already the face of a man confronting the thing he feared most. His lips moved, forming a word he didn't say. His hand tightened on the edge of the door until his knuckles went white. "Where did you get that?" he whispered. "You know where." No, that was buried. Yeah. Under a pine tree on the old Firewatch trail in Black Ridge, along with burned riding gear and a motorcycle ignition assembly that was cut with a tool and removed before you conveniently found Elias Boone's bike sitting pretty with the keys in it. Donovan closed his eyes. You were first on scene, Rick. You wrote the report. You said the motorcycle showed no signs of tampering, but somebody cut that ignition out of the harness and buried it in the same hole as the badge, which means either you didn't look closely enough, and we both know that's not how you worked, or you looked exactly as closely as you were told to look. You need to leave. Was it the sheriff's office? The Forest Service? Who told you what to write? You need to leave right now. Elias Boone was my brother. I know who he was. Donovan's voice cracked like a rifle shot. The chain jerked taut as he pressed against the door. His eyes were wet now, and his breath was coming in short, ragged gasps that spoke of something much deeper than fear. I know who he was, and I know what happened, and I've been carrying it for 7 years, and it is killing me. Do you understand? It is killing me. The door slammed shut. Gideon stood motionless. Beside him, Silas hadn't moved. The old Green Beret stood with his hands at his sides, his face unreadable, his body perfectly still. The stillness of a man who had just heard the sound of a confession trying to claw its way out of someone's chest. Inside the house, something fell. A glass, maybe. Then footsteps. Fast. Retreating. Gideon looked at Silas. Silas looked at Gideon. Neither man had to say it. The conversation was written on the silence between them. Donovan knew. Donovan had always known. And whatever he was carrying, it was heavier than retirement, an appealing house and a boat that never touched water. It was the weight of complicity, and it had been crushing him into the ground for 7 years, and the arrival of 2 men in Iron Vulture's cuts with a dead brother's badge had cracked the seal on something that could not be put back. They walked back to the motorcycles. Gideon's hands were shaking, not from cold, from the effort of not breaking down that door and pulling the truth out of Rick Donovan with his bare hands. The restraint wasn't natural, it was trained, conditioned. The same restraint that kept a ranger's finger off the trigger until the target was confirmed and the shot was clean. He pulled out his phone and called Deacon. He knows, Gideon said. Everything. He was part of the cover-up. He practically confessed through the door chain. Silence on the line. Then Deacon's voice, low and tight. Come back to the cabin, now. Why? What happened? Owen found something else inside the badge, something Elias hid. Gideon felt the ground shift beneath his feet, inside the badge. There's a hidden compartment in the back plate, sealed with resin. The kid noticed the weight was wrong, said it was heavier than a badge should be. Cal pried it open. There's a micro memory card inside, waterproof sealed, military spec. The fog was closing in around Granger now, spilling down from the mountains like something that had been sent. Gideon stood in a dead man's driveway on a dead-end road in a dying town, holding a phone to his ear, while the truth he'd spent 7 years chasing rearranged itself into something far bigger and far more dangerous than a missing rider. Elias modified his own badge, Gideon said slowly. Before he disappeared, he built a hiding place inside it, and whatever's on that card was important enough that he was willing to die to make sure it survived. A car turned onto the road. Dark sedan, no plates. Tinted windows. Moving slowly, too slowly for a residential street in a town where nobody had a reason to drive slowly. Gideon's hand dropped from his ear. His body shifted into a posture that was older than language. Weight forward, center of gravity low, every sense calibrated to the single point of threat approaching from the north end of the street. The car stopped. 200 feet away, engine idling, no doors opened, no windows rolled down, watching. Silas was already on his bike, helmet on, engine running. His eyes were locked on the sedan through his visor. Gideon, he said through the Bluetooth. One word, enough. Gideon swung onto his motorcycle, kicked the engine to life, and pulled away from the curb without looking back. Silas followed. They rode south at speed, not racing, controlled, deliberate, putting distance between themselves and the dark sedan without signaling panic. In the mirror, the sedan didn't follow. It didn't have to. It had already delivered its message. We know where you are. We know who you're talking to, and we know you're getting close. Gideon's phone buzzed in his pocket as they hit the county highway. He didn't look at it until they were 3 miles out, pulled over at a gas station with cracked pumps and a flickering sign. A new message. Same anonymous number. This time it won't be a badge they bury. He showed the screen to Silas. The old soldier read it, said nothing, and pulled his helmet back on. They rode toward Black Ridge in silence. 2 men on thundering machines burning through a landscape of fog and dying trees, carrying a dead man's secret toward a truth that had just made it clear, in language even the most cautious man couldn't misinterpret, that finding it came with a price no one had agreed to pay. And somewhere behind them, in a peeling house on a dead-end road, Rick Donovan was sitting in his kitchen with his head in his hands, staring at a phone he hadn't picked up in 7 years, knowing that the number he'd been told to call if anyone ever came asking was a number that ended conversations permanently. His finger hovered over the dial button. The choice he made in the next 30 seconds would decide whether Gideon Cross and the Iron Vulture's Brotherhood rode into Black Ridge to uncover the truth, or rode into a trap that had been waiting 7 years to close. Donovan made the call. Gideon knew it the moment he and Silas crested the last ridge before Black Ridge and saw the smoke. Not wood smoke, not the soft gray curl from Hector's stovepipe. This was black, chemical, rising in a column from somewhere deep in the tree line east of the ranger cabin, pushed sideways by a wind that hadn't existed 30 minutes ago. Silas saw it at the same time. Neither man spoke. They both opened throttle simultaneously, the engines screaming through the fog as the bikes ate the crumbling fire road at speeds that would have killed them if either one had made a single mistake. The ranger cabin was intact, but the equipment shed behind it was gone. Charred framing, collapsed tin roof. Smoke pouring from the wreckage like something alive, something angry, something that had been fed on purpose. The smell hit Gideon before he'd killed his engine. Accelerant, gasoline, the unmistakable chemical sweetness of a fire that hadn't started by accident. Deacon stood in the yard with his phone pressed to his ear, his face carved from something harder than stone. Cal was on one knee beside the porch, his medical kit open, working on Owen's right hand, which was wrapped in a blood-soaked cloth. Reno stood at the tree line with his back to the property, scanning the forest with the coiled readiness of a man expecting contact. Hector sat on the porch steps with his rifle across his knees, and his eyes locked on the burning shed with an expression that Gideon had seen only on the faces of men watching their last line of defense crumble. What happened? Gideon was off the bike and moving before the kickstand was fully down. 2 men, Deacon said, lowering the phone, came out of the trees 15 minutes after you left. Balaclavas, no visible weapons. Owen spotted them from the window. By the time we got outside, the shed was already burning. They were gone. The shed. Why the shed? Hector answered. His voice was flat. Dead. The voice of a man who had just watched the thing he feared most walk out of his nightmares and into his front yard. My records, Hector said. 32 years of patrol logs, trail maps, incident reports, everything I kept from my time with the Forest Service. I stored it all in that shed. Gideon stared at the burning wreckage. The heat was fierce enough to push him back 3 steps, the smoke stinging his eyes and settling into his lungs with each breath. They burned your records. Every page. Why? Because 3 years ago, when I found those boot prints on the Firewatch trail, I logged it. Date, time, coordinates, tread pattern. I logged everything. That's what rangers do. And when the Forest Service told me I was imagining things, I kept the log instead of turning it in. I kept all of them. And somebody knew. Somebody always knew. Gideon turned to Owen. The boy was sitting rigidly while Cal cleaned a gash across his palm, shallow but bloody, the kind of cut that comes from broken glass or torn metal. The boy's face was white, his eyes dry, his jaw clenched so tight the muscles stood out like cables under his skin. He wasn't crying, he wasn't shaking. He was doing something worse. He was pulling everything inside, compressing it, storing it in the place where children who grow up too fast keep the things they can't afford to feel. Owen, Gideon said gently. The boy looked up. You okay? I tried to get the logbooks out. His voice was small and steady and terrible. I saw the smoke and I ran to the shed before anyone could stop me. The door was already hot. I got it open and the fire was everywhere. I grabbed one box, but the shelf collapsed and... He looked at his hand. I dropped it. You ran into a burning building. It was Grandpa's stuff. It was important. Cal finished wrapping the hand and looked at Gideon with an expression that said what his mouth didn't. This kid has seen too much already, and we're about to make it worse. The memory card, Gideon said to Deacon. Tell me you still have it. Deacon reached into his cut and pulled out a small Ziploc bag. Inside was a micro SD card, black, smaller than a thumbnail. Military specification waterproof housing. The kind of storage used by intelligence units for field data collection. Rated to survive submersion, extreme temperature, and impact forces that would destroy consumer electronics. We need to see what's on it, Gideon said. We need equipment we don't have. Reno. Reno turned from the tree line. I've got a ruggedized laptop at the clubhouse. Card reader. Encryption tools if we need them. Then we go back. Not all of us. Deacon's voice carried the weight of a command decision being made in real time. Hector and Owen aren't safe here anymore. That fire was a message. Next time it won't be the shed. They come with us. Cal stays with them at the clubhouse. Gideon, Silas, Reno. We read the card. Then we decide. Decide what? Hector asked from the porch steps. Deacon looked at him. How far we're willing to go. The ride down the mountain was the longest 30 minutes of Gideon's life. Owen sat behind Cal on the road glide, wearing a helmet 2 sizes too big, his bandaged hand tucked against his chest. Hector rode in Reno's saddlebag-equipped bagger, silent, his rifle case strapped across the rear seat. 2 old men, Silas and Hector, flanking a boy who should have been in school, riding through fog toward a town that didn't know war was about to reach its doorstep. They reached the clubhouse at noon. The sky had turned the color of a bruise. Rain was coming. The air had that electric weight, that smell of ozone and wet earth that preceded mountain storms. Reno set up the laptop on the long table, plugged in the card reader, pulled the micro SD from its waterproof housing with tweezers and slotted it in as everyone gathered. Even Owen, who stood at Gideon's elbow with his wrapped hand hanging at his side, watching the screen with an intensity that made him look like a different person. Not a boy, not a man. Something in between that shouldn't exist, but did. The card loaded. 23 files. 17 were photographs, high resolution, time-stamped, taken over a period of 6 months before Elias disappeared. The images showed industrial trucks on unmarked forest roads at night. Barrels, dozens of them, being unloaded into trenches dug into the forest floor. Men in work clothes operating earth-moving equipment by the light of vehicle-mounted floods. Close-up shots of barrel markings with hazardous material symbols. Illegal dumping. Industrial waste. Buried in a national forest. The next 4 files were documents. Scanned copies of shipping manifests, permits, and correspondence between a company called Ridgeline Resource Management and the Black Ridge District Office of the Forest Service. The permits were fraudulent. Elias had annotated them with handwritten notes circling inconsistencies, false dates, signatures that didn't match public records. The final 2 files destroyed everything. File 22 was a photograph taken at night, grainy, shot from a distance through what appeared to be a telephoto lens. 3 men standing beside a trench in the forest. One of them wore a suit. One wore the uniform of a county sheriff's deputy. The third wore the badge and jacket of a Forest Service district supervisor. They were looking down into the trench. And in the trench, partially visible beneath loose soil, was a shape that was unmistakably human. File 23 was a video, 47 seconds long. No sound. Shot from the same concealed position. The video showed the 3 men covering the trench with soil using the bucket of a small excavator. When they finished, one of them, the man in the suit, turned toward the camera position and pointed, not at the camera, at the area where the camera was hidden. The video ended. Elias had been spotted, and within weeks he was gone. The silence in the clubhouse was absolute. The fluorescent lights buzzed. The rain had started outside, heavy drops hitting the corrugated roof like 1,000 small fists, demanding entry. Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. 5 men, 1 old ranger, and 1 11-year-old boy stood in a circle around a laptop screen, looking at evidence of murder, corruption, and cover-up that stretched across 7 years and reached into every institution that was supposed to protect the people who lived in the shadow of Black Ridge. Gideon's hands were on the table, palms flat, holding himself upright because the alternative was falling. The weight of what he was seeing pressed down on him like a physical force. Not just the crime, not just the corruption, but the realization that Elias had known. Elias had gathered this evidence alone. Elias had modified his own badge to create a hiding place because he didn't trust anyone, not the police, not the Forest Service, not anyone, to protect what he'd found. And he'd been right, because the people who were supposed to protect had been the ones digging the graves. "The deputy in the photo," Silas said. His voice came from far away, filtered through something thick and suffocating. "That's Donovan." Gideon looked again. The uniform, the build, the way the man stood, slightly off-center, favoring his left leg. It was Rick Donovan, the same man who had answered his door 4 hours ago and nearly confessed through a security chain. The same man who had been first on scene when Elias's motorcycle was found. The same man who wrote the report saying no signs of tampering. Because Donovan hadn't just missed the evidence. Donovan had helped create the scene. "He was part of it," Gideon said. The words came out like something being torn from muscle. From the beginning, he was in those woods burying bodies and barrels before Elias even started his investigation. When Elias disappeared, Donovan was the one they sent to sanitize the motorcycle, cut the ignition, stage the scene, write the report that closed the case. "And when we showed up at his door today," Silas added, "he called them." "The fire at the cabin," Cal said. 15 minutes after you left. That's not a coincidence. That's a response time. Donovan calls his handler. His handler dispatches a team that was already staged in the area. They hit the shed because they knew Hector's records could corroborate the evidence. They've been monitoring this from the moment Owen pulled the badge. Reno was scrolling through the shipping manifests, his face tight with focus. "Ridgeline Resource Management. I've seen this name before. Hold on." He opened a browser, searched, waited. "They're a subsidiary, shell company, registered to a holding group based out of the capital. The holding group has contracts with 6 different counties for waste disposal and remediation services." "Remediation," Deacon repeated. "They're paid to clean up waste. Instead, they dump it in national forests. And anyone who finds out gets buried next to the barrels." Hector Mercer spoke from the corner where he'd been standing motionless since the files loaded. His voice had changed. The defiance was gone. The fear was gone. What remained was something colder and more dangerous. The voice of a man who has just realized that the walls he built to protect his grandson were made of paper, and the only real protection left is the truth. "I know the man in the suit," Hector said. Every head turned. "His name is Ward Galloway. He was the county development commissioner when I started with the Forest Service. He controlled land use permits, zoning variances, access roads. Nothing moved through Black Ridge without his approval. He retired 10 years ago, officially. But people in the mountain communities still talked about him like he was running things from behind the curtain. Contracts, permits, road closures. Every time something happened in that forest that didn't make sense, his name came up in whispers." "And the Forest Service supervisor in the photo?" Gideon asked. "Neil Fenton. He ran the Black Ridge district office for 12 years. He was the one who told me I was imagining things when I reported the boot prints. He retired 2 years ago, or was retired, depends on who you ask." Gideon pulled the anonymous text messages up on his phone and set it on the table beside the laptop. "Put it back. This time it won't be a badge they bury." "Galloway, Fenton, Donovan," Gideon said. 3 names, 1 operation. Running for at least a decade. Using Black Ridge as a dumping ground for industrial waste and burying anyone who found out. Elias documented the dumping, photographed one of the burials, and was eliminated before he could go public. His badge was buried with the evidence because, Whoever killed him didn't know about the hidden compartment. They thought they were burying a trophy. Instead, they were burying the thing that would destroy them. 7 years later, Deacon said, 7 years later, a pine tree falls. A boy digs in the dirt, and the whole thing comes back. The rain intensified. The roof rattled. Water began dripping through a seam in the corrugated panels, landing on the concrete floor with a steady rhythm that sounded like a clock counting down. "We go to the feds," Cal said. "This is bigger than us. This is organized crime, environmental destruction, murder, obstruction. We hand the evidence over and let the federal agencies do their jobs." "Like they did their jobs 7 years ago?" Gideon's voice was sharp enough to cut. "The Forest Service was part of this. County law enforcement was part of this. Who exactly do you want to hand evidence to, Cal? Who do you trust? There are federal prosecutors who take 6 months to open a case, who require corroboration, who go through channels that leak information to the exact people we're trying to expose. We hand this to the wrong office. The evidence disappears, and so do we." Gideon, Deacon's voice, the command voice, the one that stopped arguments not through volume, but through the absolute certainty behind it. Cal's not wrong. Cal's not wrong about the destination. He's wrong about the timing. We go federal now with what we have, and we give them time to react, time to destroy the dump sites, time to get to Donovan before he can testify, time to get to Hector and Owen before we can protect them. We need more. More evidence, more leverage. We need Donovan's testimony, on record, before they get to him. Do you think he'll talk? Gideon thought about the man behind the door chain, the wet eyes, the cracking voice, the 7 years of weight that had been crushing him into the floor of a peeling house on a dead-end road. "He wants to talk," Gideon said. "He's been wanting to talk for 7 years. He's terrified, but he's also drowning. I saw it in his face. He's a man who made a decision he can't live with, and he's been looking for someone to give him permission to undo it." "And if they've already gotten to him?" The question hung in the air like the cigarette smoke that still clung to the clubhouse walls. "Then we're too late for Donovan. But we're not too late for the evidence. We copy the card. Multiple copies, multiple locations. If anything happens to us, the evidence survives." Reno was already moving. He pulled a portable hard drive from his bag, connected it to the laptop, and began copying files. Then he inserted a second micro SD card and cloned the original. Then a third. His fingers moved with the practiced efficiency of a man who understood that redundancy was the difference between mission success and mission failure. 4 copies, Reno said when he finished. "Original stays with Gideon. 1 copy goes with Deacon, 1 goes in the lockbox at the shop, and 1... He looked at Owen. The boy was still standing at Gideon's side, his face unreadable, his bandaged hand motionless. He'd watched every file, seen every photograph. The image of the body in the trench hadn't made him flinch, and that fact alone broke something in Gideon's chest, because an 11-year-old boy who doesn't flinch at a photograph of death is an 11-year-old boy who has already accommodated too much darkness into his understanding of the world. "No," Gideon said. "Owen's carried enough. The 4th copy goes somewhere none of them would think to look." "Where?" Gideon looked at Silas. The old soldier met his eyes and understood immediately. He nodded once. Silas had a safe deposit box at a credit union 2 counties away, under a name that didn't match his ID because the name on the box belonged to a dead man, a teammate who'd left Silas power of attorney before a mission neither of them was supposed to come back from. The box hadn't been opened in 4 years. No one alive knew it existed except Silas. "Done," Silas said and pocketed the card. The rain became a downpour. Thunder rolled across the valley. Not the sharp crack of nearby lightning, but the deep, sustained rumble of a storm system that had settled over the mountains with no intention of leaving. The kind of storm that turned fire roads into rivers and made the forest impenetrable. "We have tonight," Deacon said. "The storm buys us time. Nobody's moving on those mountain roads until morning. But tomorrow..." His phone rang. The sound cut through the room like a blade. Deacon looked at the screen, and something in his face shifted. Not fear. Recognition. The recognition of a pattern completing itself. "Unknown number," he said. He answered on speaker. "Mr. Hale." The voice was calm, male, older, the controlled, unhurried cadence of a man accustomed to having his instructions followed without question. "My name is Ward Galloway. I believe you have something that belongs to me." The room went still. Gideon's hand moved to his belt. Reno stepped back from the laptop. Cal moved in front of Owen, positioning his body between the boy and the phone, as if the voice could reach through the speaker and do harm. "I don't know you," Deacon said. His voice was flat, giving nothing away. "You know my name. Your man Gideon spoke it 20 minutes ago." "Yes, I know what happens in that building, Mr. Hale. I've known about your little brotherhood for years. You ride your motorcycles and pretend you're soldiers, and you hold your memorials for men who should have minded their own business." Deacon's jaw tightened, but his voice didn't change. "You called. Say what you need to say. The memory card, the copies, the badge, all of it. Return by midnight tomorrow. In exchange, I leave your club alone. The boy and his grandfather go back to their cabin. Life continues. And if we don't? If you don't, Mr. Hale, then what happened to Elias Boone will look merciful compared to what happens next. You have 5 men. I have resources that make 5 men meaningless. I have people in law enforcement, in the courts, in agencies you haven't even thought to worry about. I've spent 20 years building something that feeds an economy, employs hundreds of people, and generates revenue that keeps entire counties solvent. I'm not a villain in one of your campfire stories. I'm infrastructure. And infrastructure doesn't get dismantled by 5 bikers and a little boy." Silence. "Midnight tomorrow," Galloway repeated. "The ranger station at the Black Ridge trailhead. You'll know the place. Bring everything. Come alone. No copies, no clever little dead man switches, just the evidence, and we never speak again." The line went dead. For a long moment, nobody moved. The rain hammered the roof. The fluorescent lights buzzed their dying song. Water dripped from the seam in the panels onto the concrete floor, each drop landing in the puddle that had formed with a sound like a heartbeat. "He's not offering a deal," Reno said quietly. "He's setting a kill box. The ranger station is a clearing, no cover. 1 road in, same road out. We show up, we don't leave." "I know," Deacon said. "Then we don't show up." Deacon looked around the table. At Gideon, whose face was set in the expression of a man who had passed through rage and come out the other side into something colder and more focused. At Silas, motionless, calculating. At Cal, still standing in front of Owen like a wall. At Reno, whose hands were already moving, closing the laptop, packing gear, thinking 3 steps ahead because that was the only way he knew how to survive. At Owen, who looked up at the men around him with eyes that held something Gideon had seen only once before, in the face of a child in a village in Afghanistan, a girl no older than 8, who stood in the doorway of a house that had just been shelled and looked at the soldiers in front of her, not with fear, but with the terrible patience of someone waiting to see if the adults would do the right thing. "We're not giving him the evidence," Gideon said. "No," Deacon agreed. "We're not. And we're not running. No." "Then we go to the only person who can break this open before midnight tomorrow. We go to Donovan, tonight, in this storm, before Galloway gets to him first. We pull the testimony out of him, we combine it with the physical evidence, and we transmit everything simultaneously to every federal agency, every news outlet, and every watchdog organization we can reach. Not through channels, not through process, a broadcast. An information bomb that can't be contained, can't be buried, and can't be traced back to a single source they can eliminate. And if Donovan won't talk, he'll talk." Gideon's voice was quiet, absolute, and heavy with something that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with the face of a man behind a door chain who had been begging to confess for 7 years. "He just needs to know he's not alone." Deacon stood. The movement was slow and deliberate. The movement of a man crossing a threshold he'd known was coming since the moment a rusted badge landed on his table. "Silas, you're with Gideon, Donovan's house. Get his statement. Cal, you stay with Owen and Hector. Lock this building. Nobody in, nobody out. Reno, you set up the transmission infrastructure. Every contact you have. FBI field office, EPA criminal division, state attorney general, investigative journalists. Build the distribution list. When Gideon calls and says go, you push the button and everything goes everywhere at once. He looked at Gideon. You understand what this means. The moment we transmit, we're exposed, every one of us. Our names, our faces, our addresses. Galloway's people will come. Law enforcement will come. Media will come. Everything we've built, the brotherhood, the clubhouse, the life, becomes the center of something we can't control. I know. And you're willing. Gideon pulled the badge from his pocket. Elias's badge. The iron weight of it sat in his palm like a compass pointing in only one direction. Elias died alone in those mountains because he tried to do this by himself. He didn't trust anyone enough to share what he found, and they killed him for it. They buried him, and they buried his evidence, and they spent 7 years making sure nobody ever came looking. He closed his fist around the badge. I'm not Elias. I'm not alone, and I'm not going to let them bury this again. Lightning split the sky outside. The thunder came a half-second later, close, percussive, shaking the building down to its foundation. The lights flickered. The compressor in the back room kicked on and died. Rain lashed the walls with a violence that sounded personal. Move, Deacon said. They moved. Cal guided Owen and Hector to the back room, a reinforced storage area with a steel door and no windows that the Brotherhood had built years ago for reasons nobody discussed in polite company. Inside were cots, water, a first aid station, and enough supplies to last 72 hours. Cal locked the door from inside and didn't look back. Reno sat down at the laptop and opened a communications platform Gideon had never seen before. Something he'd built himself, probably, because Reno built things the way other people breathed. His fingers moved across the keys with the mechanical precision of a pianist playing from muscle memory. Distribution lists, encrypted file transfers, dead drops, redundancies layered on redundancies. Gideon and Silas geared up in the garage. Rain jackets over cuts. Helmet sealed, boots laced tight. Gideon checked the knife on his belt, the flashlight in his vest, the phone in his pocket. Silas did the same with the economy of a man who'd been preparing for missions in bad weather for 40 years. They rolled the bikes to the garage door. The rain was a solid wall, not falling, pouring, as if the sky had simply opened and emptied itself onto the earth with a fury that felt deliberate. If Donovan's already gone, Silas said, then we find where they took him. And if he's dead? Gideon swung onto his bike. The engine turned over and the exhaust note was swallowed immediately by the storm, reduced from thunder to a whisper against the hammering rain. Then the evidence speaks for him, and we make sure it speaks loud enough that no one will ever be able to silence it again. They rode into the storm. The highway was a river. The headlights turned the rain into a wall of white static that eliminated depth perception and reduced the world to the 10 feet of visible road directly ahead. Gideon rode by feel, reading the crown of the pavement through the handlebars, adjusting lean angles by instinct, trusting the machine beneath him because trust was the only currency that worked at 60 miles an hour in zero visibility. 37 minutes to Granger in dry conditions. Tonight, it would take longer. Tonight, every mile was a negotiation between speed and survival. Tonight, the mountain was trying to keep them from reaching the man who held the last piece of the puzzle. Halfway to Granger, Gideon's phone buzzed. He couldn't check it. Both hands on the bars, both eyes on the vanishing road. The message would wait. It couldn't wait. Because the message was from Cal, back at the clubhouse, and it contained 6 words that changed everything. Someone is trying to get in. Gideon couldn't stop, couldn't turn around, couldn't split himself between the 2 things that mattered most, the man in Granger who held testimony that could bring everything down, and the brothers back at the clubhouse who were under attack with a child and an old man locked in the back room. The phone buzzed again. Cal's voice through the Bluetooth, broken by static and rain. 2 vehicles, east side. They're hitting the roll-up door with something heavy. Reno's got the back secured, but the signal dropped. Gideon's chest contracted. Every instinct trained into him across 12 years of combat screamed to reverse course, to ride back, to put his body between the threat and the people he'd sworn to protect. But the ranger in him, the part that understood tactical geometry better than he understood his own emotions, knew the math. 41 minutes back to the clubhouse. By the time he arrived, whatever was going to happen would already be finished. Cal and Reno were combat veterans. The back room was steel and concrete. Owen and Hector were behind a locked door with a man who'd kept soldiers alive in firefights that had killed everyone around them. Donovan was alone. Donovan was the weakest link, and Galloway knew it. "Silas," Gideon said through the comm, "Cal's under contact at the clubhouse." "I heard." "We keep going." A pause. 2 seconds. 3. The rain screamed against their helmets, and the road disappeared under their tires in a sliding current of water and gravel. "We keep going," Silas confirmed. They rode. Granger materialized through the storm like a ghost town. Dark houses, flooded streets, not a single light burning except the yellow flicker of a gas station sign 3 blocks from Donovan's road. The power was out in most of the neighborhood. Fallen branches littered the yards. A transformer somewhere had blown. Gideon could smell the ozone through his rain-soaked balaclava. They turned onto Donovan's street. The house was dark, but the front door was open, not ajar. Open, wide open. Rain blowing into the entryway, pooling on the floor, reflecting nothing because there was nothing inside to reflect. The security chain that had stopped Gideon 12 hours ago hung from one screw, the other ripped clean out of the frame. Gideon killed his engine and was off the bike before it stopped rolling. His boots hit the flooded pavement and he drew his knife. Not because he planned to use it, but because the weight in his hand organized his thinking the way a weapon always did. Silas was beside him in 3 strides, moving with the fluid silence of a man who'd done room clearances in places where the penalty for noise was death. They entered without speaking. The living room was destroyed. Furniture overturned, lamp shattered on the hardwood floor. A bookshelf pulled forward, its contents scattered. Paperbacks, framed photos. A folded flag in a glass case that had cracked but not broken. The kitchen beyond was worse. Cabinets open, drawers pulled out and dumped, a chair on its side with one leg snapped off. But no blood, no body. "Basement," Silas said. A door at the end of the hallway, standing open, stairs leading down into darkness. Gideon descended first, flashlight in his left hand, knife in his right. The beam cut through the dark and found concrete walls, a water heater, storage shelves. And in the far corner, behind a workbench covered in tools and fishing tackle, a man sitting on the floor with his back against the wall and his arms wrapped around his knees. Rick Donovan, alive. Shaking so hard his teeth were audible, a rapid clicking that sounded mechanical, inhuman, the full-body tremor of a man whose nervous system had been overloaded past the point of voluntary control. "Rick," Gideon said. Donovan's head came up. His face was swollen on the left side, a bruise forming across his cheekbone and eye socket. His lip was split. Blood had dried in a line from his nose to his chin. His eyes were wide and wet, and filled with something that went beyond fear into the territory where fear becomes its own ecosystem, self-sustaining, consuming everything. "They came," Donovan whispered. 20 minutes after you left this morning, 2 men. They said if I talked to you again, they'd..." He stopped. His breathing hitched. "They showed me pictures of my daughter at her school, picking up her kids, my grandchildren. They had photographs of my grandchildren." Gideon crouched in front of him, close enough to see every broken capillary in the man's eyes, close enough to smell the sweat and fear and the sharp tang of urine where Donovan had lost control at some point during the hours he'd spent sitting in his own basement, waiting for the next knock. "Rick, look at me." Donovan's eyes focused, barely. They came back tonight. The storm knocked the power out and they came through the front door. I was in the kitchen. I heard the chain break. I ran down here and they searched the house. I could hear them above me, walking opening everything, was looking for something. Looking for what? I don't know. I don't. He stopped again, pressed his fists against his temples. No, I do know. There's a file, a paper file. I kept a copy of the original incident report, the real one, the one I wrote before they made me rewrite it. I kept it in a lockbox in my bedroom closet. Did they find it? Donovan's face crumpled. I moved it. Last month, I don't know why. Instinct, maybe. I moved it into the crawl space under the porch, behind the insulation. They won't find it there. They won't think to look there. Gideon looked at Silas. The old soldier was already moving toward the stairs. Silas, crawl space, under the porch, I'll get it. He disappeared up the steps with the silence of smoke rising. Gideon turned back to Donovan. Outside, the storm raged with an intensity that shook the house on its foundation. Water was seeping under the basement walls, pooling on the concrete in dark, spreading stains. Rick, I need you to listen to me very carefully. The evidence Elias Boone hid in his badge. We found it. We've seen it. We know about the dumping. We know about the bodies. We know about Galloway, Fenton, and you. We have photographs, documents, and video. And right now, the only thing keeping that evidence from going to every federal agency and newsroom in the country is the fact that I'm standing in your basement instead of pushing the button. Donovan stared at him. I don't want to destroy you, Rick. I want Galloway. I want the men who killed Ellis and buried him in the forest like garbage. And I need your testimony to do it. The real testimony. On record. What you saw, what you did, who gave the orders, everything. If I talk, my daughter, my grandchildren, if you don't talk, Galloway wins. He keeps operating. He keeps dumping. He keeps burying people. And your grandchildren grow up in a world where the man who threatened them is still in power and still untouchable. Is that what you want? I want them safe. Then help me end this tonight, because tomorrow Galloway expects us to hand the evidence back at midnight. And when we don't show up, he'll escalate. He'll come for all of us, including you. You're a loose end, Rick. You've always been a loose end. The only reason you're still alive is because killing a retired deputy attracts attention. But after tonight, after he knows the evidence is out, he won't care about attention anymore. He'll care about silence. The trembling in Donovan's body slowed, not stopped. Nothing would stop it tonight, but the frequency changed. The involuntary vibration of a terrified animal began to shift into the rigid tension of a man approaching a decision he'd been circling for 7 years. I watched them kill him, Donovan said. The words fell like stones into still water. Elias Boone, I was there, not at the burial, at the beginning. They caught him on the Firewatch trail. He was photographing a dump site. Galloway's men grabbed him, brought him to the old ranger station clearing. Galloway was there. Fenton was there. His voice broke. They asked him where the evidence was, where the photographs were stored. He wouldn't say. He wouldn't say a single word. He looked at them like they were nothing, like they couldn't touch him, and they beat him for an hour, maybe longer. I stood there, and I watched, and I didn't do anything. Tears ran down Donovan's battered face, mixing with the dried blood, cutting channels through the grime. When it was over, Galloway told me to find the evidence on his motorcycle. I searched the bike. I found nothing because there was nothing to find. He'd already hidden the card in his badge, and they'd taken his cut. But they didn't check the badge. They threw it in the hole with everything else, a trophy, something to bury with the rest of it. And the motorcycle? I swapped the ignition assembly, replaced it with a stock unit, cleaned the tool marks, positioned the bike on the fire road, and reported it as an abandoned vehicle. The case was closed within 3 months. Accidental exposure. Body unrecovered. Where is Elias buried? Donovan closed his eyes. The dump site, the main one, 2 miles northeast of where your boy found the badge. He swallowed. There are others. 4 that I know of. People who found the sites. Hikers. A journalist from Ridgemont. A water quality inspector who took samples from the creek downstream. They all disappeared over a 10-year period, all attributed to wilderness accidents. All cases closed by my office. Gideon's vision darkened at the edges. He felt his heartbeat in his jaw, in his fists, in the joints of his fingers where they gripped the knife handle with enough force to turn his knuckles white. The rage was there, vast, incandescent, a furnace that could power him through walls and doors and the bodies of every man responsible for what he was hearing. But the rage was contained, directed, channeled into the cold, precise focus that had kept him alive in places where rage without discipline was just another way to die. Footsteps on the stairs. Silas descended with a rusted lockbox under his arm, water streaming from his jacket, his face set in the expression of a man who had found what he was looking for and wished he hadn't. "Got it," Silas said, "and we need to move. There's a vehicle at the end of the street, headlights off, engine running." Gideon stood and pulled Donovan to his feet. The retired deputy swayed but held. His legs were weak, his face a wreck, his clothes soaked with sweat and basement water. But his eyes had changed. Something behind them had unlocked, the look of a man who has finally spoken the unspeakable and found that the weight, while still crushing, has shifted enough to let him breathe. "You're coming with us," Gideon said. "Where?" "Somewhere with walls and men who know how to defend them. And then you're going to say everything you just said to me into a camera. And then it goes out, all of it, to everyone. Galloway will kill my family. Galloway is going to be too busy surviving the next 48 hours to kill anyone." Gideon gripped Donovan's arm. Not rough, not gentle, the grip of a man pulling another man out of a hole. "Your family gets a call from the FBI tomorrow morning. Protective custody. Galloway's people get arrested before they can make a move. That's how this ends. Not with deals, not with silence, with the truth hitting so hard and so fast that everyone involved is still blinking when the handcuffs go on." They moved through the destroyed house quickly. Silas on point, Gideon guiding Donovan, the flashlight cutting through rooms that smelled of fear and violence and rain. At the front door, Silas paused, scanned the street through the storm. The vehicle was still there. 200 yards east, dark shape, no movement visible. "We go loud," Silas said. "They already know we're here. No point in being subtle." They walked to the bikes. Donovan climbed onto the back of Gideon's road cane, his arms wrapping around Gideon's torso with the desperate grip of a man who had just placed his entire existence in the hands of a stranger on a motorcycle. The engines fired. The sound ripped through the dead neighborhood like a declaration of war. They rode west. Fast. The dark vehicle's headlights flared to life in the mirror, pursuit beginning. Gideon leaned into the first turn and felt Donovan's weight shift behind him, uncoordinated, terrified, adding drag and instability to every maneuver. He compensated, adjusted, rode the way you ride with a wounded man on your back, smooth inputs, no sudden corrections, letting the machine do the work. Silas rode ahead, clearing the route, his brake light flashing in a pattern that communicated turns and hazards in a language the two men had developed over years of riding together. Left, right, debris and road, clear intersection. The pursuit vehicle fell behind in the residential streets, too wide to navigate the turns that motorcycles ate without slowing. By the time Gideon hit the county highway, the headlights in his mirror were gone. But they wouldn't stay gone. He called Deacon. The line connected on the second ring. "Status," Gideon said. "Contained." Deacon's voice was tight, winded, carrying the specific breathlessness of a man who had recently been engaged in physical violence. They breached the roll-up door with a truck. 4 men, armed. Reno dropped the first one with a tire iron before he cleared the threshold. I handled the second. The other 2 pulled back when they realized we weren't civilians. "They're gone. Cal and the others are secured." "Injuries?" "Reno's got a gash on his forearm. Superficial. Deacon Hale has a bruised rib and a very bad attitude. Owen and Hector are untouched." Relief flooded through Gideon's body like warm water into frozen veins. He let himself feel it for exactly 2 seconds. Then he locked it away. "I have Donovan," he talked. "Everything. Elias was murdered. There are more bodies." Galloway ran the entire operation. I have Donovan's original incident report and his verbal confession. We're 20 minutes out. Get here. Reno's ready to transmit. He just needs the go signal. 20 minutes! Gideon pushed the Road King to 80 on the straightaway. The rain was easing, the storm's fury spent, its remnants drizzling across the highway in a fine mist that the headlight turned into a shimmering curtain. Donovan's grip tightened with every acceleration. The man was shaking again, but differently now. Not the paralytic tremor of a man trapped in his own basement, the controlled vibration of a man in motion, heading towards something instead of hiding from it. They reached the clubhouse at 9:47. The roll-up door was destroyed, bent inward on its tracks. The steel panels crumpled where a truck bumper had driven through. Inside, the damage was visible but contained. Overturned furniture, a broken window, blood on the concrete near the entrance. Not much, but enough to tell a story about the first man who'd come through the door and met Reno's tire iron. Reno was at the laptop. His left forearm was wrapped in gauze, a bloom of red seeping through, but his fingers moved across the keyboard without pause. The distribution list glowed on the screen, 47 addresses, FBI field offices, EPA criminal enforcement, state attorney general. 4 investigative journalists Reno had vetted through channels Gideon didn't ask about. 2 senators' offices, a federal judge's clerk. Deacon stood at the center of the room. His cut was torn at the shoulder. A bruise was darkening across his right cheekbone. He held a tire iron in his left hand, not Reno's, his own. The steel streaked with something Gideon didn't need to examine closely. Cal emerged from the back room with Owen and Hector. The boy's face was pale but composed. The old man's rifle was in his hands, the stock braced against his hip. Neither of them had been touched. Cal's medical kit was open on the floor where he'd been treating Reno's arm through a crack in the steel door. "Donovan," Deacon said, looking at the shattered man standing behind Gideon. "He's ready." Reno produced a phone and set it to record video. Cal positioned a chair under the one working fluorescent light, the harsh white beam creating a pool of clarity in the damaged room, like a spotlight on a stage that nobody wanted to stand on. Donovan sat down. He looked at the phone, at the red recording light, at the faces of the men surrounding him, bikers, veterans, brothers in a covenant he'd spent 7 years running from. His mouth opened, closed. His hands gripped the edges of the chair. "Start from the beginning," Gideon said. "Your name, your rank, your badge number, and then everything." Donovan spoke for 23 minutes. He didn't stop. He didn't hesitate. The words came out of him in a continuous stream, as if a dam had broken, and 7 years of impounded truth was pouring through the breach with a force that couldn't be controlled or redirected. Names, dates, locations, body counts, the mechanics of corruption, how Galloway recruited local officials, how Fenton controlled access to the forest, how the dumping contracts generated millions in revenue while the waste poisoned groundwater, killed wildlife, and turned an entire mountain ecosystem into a chemical graveyard. He described Elias Boone's murder in detail that made Cal turn away and Silas close his eyes. He described the other victims. The hiker from Portland who'd stumbled onto a dump site and been reported as a drowning victim 3 days later. The journalist who'd been investigating water contamination and vanished during a solo camping trip. The water quality inspector whose car was found at the bottom of a ravine with the brake lines cut. He described his own role, the falsified reports, the misdirected investigations, the phone calls from Galloway that came at 2 a.m, telling him where to go, what to write, how to make a murdered human being disappear into the bureaucratic machinery of a county that had been captured so completely that the corruption was invisible from the inside. When he finished, the room was silent. Reno stopped the recording, compressed the file, added it to the distribution package alongside the photographs, documents, video, and scanned copies of Donovan's original incident report. 47 recipients, Reno said. Simultaneous encrypted transmission. Once I press send, this reaches every address on the list within 90 seconds. There is no recall. There is no undo. The evidence will exist in 47 independent locations within 2 minutes, and from there it will propagate beyond anyone's ability to contain it. He looked at Deacon. Deacon looked at Gideon. Gideon looked at the badge in his hand. Elias's badge. The vulture with spread wings. The road name stamped in steel by a dead man's hand 7 years ago in a workshop that smelled of hot metal and old country music. He thought about Elias riding 11 hours through the night to pull him out of a hole. He thought about the silence in the mountains every October when he rode the ridge alone. He thought about Owen walking through the fog with a backpack full of truth he didn't understand but knew mattered. He thought about Donovan sitting in his basement for 7 years, drowning in complicity, waiting for someone to give him permission to breathe. "Send it," Gideon said. Reno pressed enter. The screen flashed. Progress bars filled. Confirmation messages began populating the log. Delivered, delivered, delivered. Each one a nail in the coffin of everything Ward Galloway had built. For 17 seconds, nobody moved. Then Gideon's phone rang. Galloway's number. He answered. "You made a mistake," Galloway said. The calm was gone. The measured, controlled cadence had been replaced by something raw, something wounded. The voice of a man watching his empire disintegrate in real time. "You think sending files to bureaucrats protects you? I have people in those offices. I have people everywhere. Half those emails will be deleted before anyone opens them." "Not half," Gideon said. "I know which offices you own. Reno knows which offices you own. That's why we sent to 47. You can't own them all, Galloway. Nobody can." Silence on the line. Heavy breathing. The sound of a man recalculating. "The ranger station," Galloway said. "1 hour. I'm not coming to your kill box. Then I'll come to yours." The line went dead. Gideon looked at Deacon. "He's coming here," Gideon said. "I know. With everything he has left. I know." Deacon turned to the room. 5 men, 1 retired deputy who'd just burned his own life to the ground, 1 old ranger with a rifle and 32 years of mountain knowledge, and 1 11-year-old boy who stood in the corner with his bandaged hand at his side and his eyes locked on the men around him with an expression that contained no fear, only the fierce, unshakable trust of a child who had decided that these men were worth believing in. "We don't run," Deacon said. "We've never run, not from combat. Not from anyone who came at our brothers. Not from anything." He set the tire iron down on the table. "Cal, take Owen, Hector, and Donovan out the back. Reno's truck, the safe house in Elmdale, the one we set up after the Cedar Creek situation. You drive. You don't stop. You don't answer any phone that isn't mine." Cal nodded. No argument, no hesitation. He moved toward Owen and knelt down to meet the boy's eyes. "We're going for a ride," Cal said gently. "Different kind of ride. No motorcycles this time." "I don't want to leave," Owen said. "I know. They're going to fight. That's what they do, and they're very good at it." Owen looked past Cal to Gideon. The boy's eyes were wet, but the tears didn't fall. He held them there through sheer force of will, an 11-year-old boy refusing to cry in front of the men he'd chosen to trust with the most dangerous thing he'd ever found. Gideon crossed the room and knelt in front of him. "Owen, listen to me. You started this. You found the badge. You walked out of the fog and handed it to a stranger because you understood something that most people spend their whole lives pretending they don't. That silence is the same thing as complicity. Everything that happens tonight, everything that comes after, started with you. You did that. Remember it." He pulled the badge from his pocket, not the original, but the first copy of the memory card sealed in its waterproof case, and pressed it into Owen's good hand. "Hold this. Don't let go, no matter what." Owen closed his fingers around it. "Go," Gideon said. Cal led them out through the back door into the rain. The truck started. Headlights flared. Tires on wet gravel. Then they were gone, swallowed by the storm and the night and the narrow roads that led away from what was coming. 4 men remained. Gideon, Deacon, Silas, Reno. 4 veterans standing in a damaged clubhouse on the edge of a dying town, waiting for a man with unlimited resources and nothing left to lose to bring war to their doorstep. Reno began working without being told, barricading the breached roll-up door with the workbenches from the garage. positioning the remaining vehicles as exterior barriers, rigging the emergency lighting system, battery-powered floods mounted on tripods, aimed outward, designed to blind anyone approaching from the parking lot. Silas checked the perimeter. Every window, every door, every blind spot and firing lane and angle of approach, mapping the building's defensive geometry with the practiced eye of a man who had fortified positions under fire on 4 continents. Deacon and Gideon stood at the center of the room. 2 men, president and enforcer, Marine and Ranger, brothers in a covenant that predated the club, predated the road, predated everything except the fundamental understanding that some things are worth fighting for even when the odds say you shouldn't. "When this is over," Deacon said, "we're going to find him." "Elias? We're going to bring him home. Whatever's left, we're going to find him and bring him home and give him the ride he deserved." Gideon's throat closed. He nodded because words wouldn't come. Headlights appeared at the far end of the industrial road. 3 vehicles, moving in formation. Slow, deliberate. The spacing military precise, 20 meters between each one, maintaining sight lines, coordinating approach vectors. Reno hit the floods. White light exploded across the parking lot, turning the rain into a wall of silver fire and illuminating 3 black SUVs rolling to a stop in a semicircle 50 yards from the building. Doors opened. Men emerged. 8, 10, 12. Dark clothing, tactical posture. Moving to positions with the rehearsed coordination of professionals. Not soldiers, but contractors. The kind of men Galloway's money could buy at short notice from private security firms that didn't ask questions about operational objectives. And behind them, stepping out of the lead vehicle with the measured composure of a man who still believed he controlled the outcome, was Ward Galloway. He was older than his photograph, 70 maybe, tall, thin in the way of men who maintain themselves through discipline rather than health. Silver hair cropped short, an overcoat that cost more than most of the houses in Millhaven, now darkening with rain. His face was the face of authority, composed, entitled, accustomed to rooms that went quiet when he entered. He walked to the edge of the floodlit perimeter and stopped. "Mr. Cross," he called. His voice carried through the rain with the projection of a man who'd spent decades addressing rooms full of people who didn't dare interrupt. "I believe we should talk." Gideon stepped through the ruined garage door and into the light. Rain hit his face and ran down his neck into his collar. The cold was immediate, sharp, a physical thing that pressed against his skin like a warning. Behind him, barely visible in the shadows of the clubhouse, 3 men held their positions. Waiting. Ready. "Talk," Gideon said. Galloway studied him. The floodlights cast deep shadows under his brow, turning his eyes into dark hollows that reflected nothing. "You've made your point," Galloway said. "The evidence is out. My attorneys will argue authenticity, chain of custody, and jurisdiction for years. You've created noise. Congratulations. But noise fades. Investigations stall. Witnesses recant. The system is slower than you think and more forgiving than you imagine, especially toward men who built things that matter. You built a graveyard. I built an economy. Jobs, contracts, revenue streams that kept communities alive when the mills shut down and the federal government forgot these mountains existed. The waste disposal was a necessary compromise. Ugly, yes, but the alternative was bankruptcy, collapse. Towns dying not slowly, but overnight. And the people you killed. Collateral, regrettable. But every infrastructure project in history has its casualties. You served in the military, Mr. Cross. You know exactly what I mean. Gideon's hands hung at his sides. His right hand was 2 inches from the knife on his belt. His left hand was empty, open, the fingers slightly curled. The posture of a man holding himself in check through an act of will that consumed more energy than anyone watching could have understood. "Elias Boone," Gideon said. "Say his name." Elias Boone was a man who couldn't mind his own business. "Say what you did to him." Galloway's composure flickered. A micro-expression, annoyance maybe, or something deeper. The involuntary response of a man who has just been asked to confront the one thing his narrative can't accommodate. He was given every opportunity to walk away. He was beaten and murdered. He chose his outcome, the same way you're choosing yours. Galloway raised his hand. Behind him, 12 men shifted. Weapons appeared, not firearms, but impact tools. Batons, crowbars. The hardware of men instructed to cause damage without leaving the kind of evidence that bullet casings create. Last chance, Mr. Cross. The memory card, the original. I know you still have it. Gideon reached into his cut and pulled out Elias's badge. Not the memory card, the badge. The iron vulture with spread wings. The road name hammered into steel by hands that would never forge anything again. He held it up in the floodlight. This is what Elias left behind, Gideon said. Not the evidence, not the photographs. This, his badge. The thing he made with his own hands in a workshop that smelled like hot metal and old music. He built a hiding place inside it because he knew he was going to die, and he wanted to make sure the truth survived. He didn't hide it for revenge. He didn't hide it for justice. He hid it because he believed, because he had to believe that someday someone honest would find it. His voice didn't rise. It dropped, lower, harder, the voice of a man speaking to the dead as much as to the living. An 11-year-old boy found it, a child, the most honest person on this mountain. And now you're standing in a parking lot with 12 hired men and a lifetime of money telling me that the system will protect you, that investigations stall, that witnesses recant. He lowered the badge. Elias didn't recant. Donovan didn't recant. I'm not going to recant. And the 47 offices that just received every piece of evidence you've spent 7 years burying aren't going to recant either. He stepped forward, one step, into the rain, into the floodlight, into the space between the clubhouse and the semicircle of vehicles and men, and the old man in the expensive overcoat who had just realized, in the deepest and most private part of his mind, that the infrastructure he'd built was collapsing not under the weight of evidence or institutional pressure, but under the weight of a single iron badge and the chain of loyalty it represented. Galloway's hand dropped. The 12 men charged, and behind Gideon, 3 iron vultures stepped into the light with tire irons and wrenches and the silent, terrifying calm of men who had survived wars fought by entire nations and were absolutely not, going to be stopped by 12 contractors in a rainy parking lot on the edge of a town that the rest of the world had forgotten. The first man reached Gideon and swung a baton at his head. Gideon stepped inside the arc, caught the man's wrist, and drove his knee into the attacker's midsection with a force that folded him in half. The baton clattered to the wet asphalt. Gideon picked it up without breaking stride. Silas met the second and third attackers simultaneously. He moved with an economy that defied his age. No wasted motion, no theatrical swings, just precise, devastating applications of force to joints and pressure points that dropped both men in 4 seconds. One crawled away. The other didn't move. Reno fought like a man born in violence and baptized in it. Low, fast, his wounded arm forgotten, a wrench in each hand creating a zone of destruction that no one entered without consequence. He took a hit to the ribs that staggered him. He absorbed it, set his feet, and answered with a backhand strike that sent his attacker's baton spinning into the darkness. Deacon fought the way a chapter president fights. Not for himself, but for the line. He positioned himself at the garage door, the threshold, the point where the building's interior met the parking lot's chaos, and he held it. Every man who tried to get past him was met with the controlled fury of a former Marine who had held positions against odds far worse than 12-4 and had never, not once, given ground. The fight lasted 90 seconds. It felt like 90 hours. When it ended, 7 of Galloway's men were down. 3 were retreating toward the vehicles. 2 had simply run, disappearing into the industrial darkness beyond the reach of the floods. Galloway stood where he had been standing the entire time, untouched. His overcoat was soaked through. His face had changed. The authority was gone. The composure was gone. And what remained was something Gideon recognized with the clarity of a man who had seen it on battlefields and in basement interrogation rooms, and in the eyes of every powerful man who had ever watched his power prove insufficient. Fear. In the distance, sirens. Not one, multiple, growing louder, coming from the highway, from the town, from directions that suggested a coordinated response rather than a single patrol car responding to a noise complaint. Reno's transmission had worked. Someone in one of those 47 offices had read the files, seen the video, heard Donovan's testimony, and made a phone call that had cascaded through the federal system with the speed and irreversibility of a chain reaction. Galloway heard the sirens. His head turned toward the sound. His hands, which had been perfectly still throughout the entire confrontation, began to tremble. "It's over," Gideon said. Galloway looked at him. The fear was fully visible now. Not the fear of arrest, not the fear of prison, but the deeper, more devastating fear of a man who has just realized that the story he told himself about who he was and what he built was a lie. And the lie is now visible to everyone, and there is no version of the future where it becomes invisible again. "He died protecting that badge," Galloway said quietly. The words seemed to come from somewhere outside his control. Not a boast, not a defense, but a confession that had been compressed under 20 years of self-justification and was finally escaping. "Your friend, Boone. They hit him for an hour and he never let go of it. They had to pry it from his hands after he stopped moving. I asked him why. Why protect a piece of metal when giving it up might save his life? Do you know what he said?" Gideon's chest was heaving. Blood from a cut above his eye ran down his cheek and mixed with the rain. His knuckles were split open. His knee was screaming. His body was a catalog of damage that he would feel tomorrow and the day after and every day for the rest of his life. "What did he say?" Galloway's voice was barely audible above the sirens. He said, "Because someone I trust will come looking for it." The words hit Gideon harder than any blow he'd taken. His vision blurred. His breath stopped. The rain fell on his face, and he couldn't feel it because every nerve in his body was processing something that went beyond physical sensation into the place where grief and love and rage and loyalty converge into a single point of light, so bright it burns everything around it to ash. Elias had known. Elias had known that Gideon would come, not hoped. Known. With the absolute certainty of a man who had ridden 11 hours through the night to knock on a door because he'd already decided the outcome before the conversation started. Blue and red lights appeared at the end of the industrial road, federal vehicles marked and unmarked converging on the clubhouse from both directions with the coordinated precision of an operation that had been mobilized at speed. Galloway didn't run. He stood in the rain in his ruined overcoat and watched the lights approach with the stillness of a man who has reached the end of a road he built himself and found that it led exactly where everyone warned him it would. Gideon stood 10 feet away, Elias's badge in his bleeding hand, the rain washing the blood from the iron face of the vulture as the sirens grew louder and the night fractured into red and blue and white. And the first federal agents emerged from their vehicles with weapons drawn and voices sharp and the machinery of accountability. Finally, after 7 years of silence, began to turn. The federal agents moved through the parking lot with the mechanical precision of a system engaging. 12 of them. Body armor, sidearms drawn. Voices sharp with the clipped authority of men and women who had been woken from sleep, briefed in moving vehicles, and deployed to a scene they were still trying to understand. Ward Galloway didn't resist. He stood in the rain with his hands at his sides as 2 agents approached him, and when one of them said his name and began reciting his rights, he simply closed his eyes. Not in defeat, in recognition. The look of a man watching the last card turn over in a game he'd been playing for 20 years, discovering that the hand he'd been holding was worthless all along. They cuffed him in front. Silver bracelets on wrists that had signed contracts worth millions, shaken hands with governors, directed the burial of human beings in the forest he'd turned into his private empire. He was placed in the back of an unmarked sedan without ceremony. The door closed. The interior light went dark. And just like that, the man who had controlled Black Ridge for 2 decades became a passenger in someone else's vehicle, heading somewhere he couldn't negotiate his way out of. Gideon watched it happen from 20 feet away. He was sitting on the wet asphalt with his back against the clubhouse wall, his legs stretched out in front of him, his hands resting on his thighs with the palms up because closing his fists hurt too much. The cut above his eye had stopped bleeding, but the skin around it was swelling, pushing his vision into a narrowing tunnel. His left knee had locked during the fight, and now throbbed with a deep structural pain that told him something had torn. Not broken, but torn. The kind of soft tissue damage that would take months to heal if he let it, which he wouldn't. A woman in a Navy windbreaker with FBI stenciled across the back approached him. Early 40s. Dark hair pulled back. The composed, assessing face of someone who had walked into chaotic scenes before and knew how to extract order from them. Gideon Cross? Yeah? Special Agent Dana Whitfield. I need to ask you some questions. I need to ask you one first. She waited. Rick Donovan's family, his daughter and grandchildren, they need protective custody. Tonight. Before anyone in Galloway's network has time to make a phone call. Whitfield studied him for a moment, reading the blood, the bruises, the leather cut with its torn shoulder and rain-darkened patches, the man underneath all of it who was sitting on the ground in a parking lot at 10:30 at night asking about the safety of someone else's family before he'd even assessed his own injuries. Already in motion, she said. The evidence package your man transmitted included a threat assessment. We dispatched agents to the Donovan residence 40 minutes ago. The family is being relocated. Gideon exhaled, a long, slow release that carried 7 years of compressed air out of his lungs and left him feeling emptier and lighter than he'd felt since the day he rode up Black Ridge and found nothing but silence where his best friend used to be. Now, Whitfield said, the questions. The questioning took 3 hours. First Gideon, then Deacon, then Silas, then Reno, each one separately, each one telling the same story from a different angle, the overlapping testimonies creating a three-dimensional picture of events that no single perspective could capture alone. Federal forensic teams were already being mobilized to Black Ridge. The coordinates Reno had logged for the burial site were transmitted to a hazmat response unit that would arrive at first light. Warrants were being drafted for Neil Fenton's arrest. Galloway's financial records were being subpoenaed from 6 different jurisdictions simultaneously. The machine was turning, slowly, imperfectly, with the grinding reluctance of any systems forced to confront its own failures, but turning. At 2 a.m, Whitfield told them they could go. Don't leave the county, she said. We'll need follow-up interviews, probably several. We're not going anywhere, Deacon said. The agents left. The parking lot emptied. The sirens faded. And the 4 men stood in the wreckage of their clubhouse under a sky that had finally stopped raining, the clouds breaking apart in ragged patches to reveal stars that had been there the entire time. Hidden, waiting, indifferent to everything that had happened below. But Reno sat down on an overturned workbench and pressed his good hand against his wounded forearm. The gauze was soaked through. Rain, sweat, blood, all mixed into a single dark stain that spread across the white fabric like a map of the night's cost. I need stitches, he said matter-of-factly. Cal will handle it when he gets back, Deacon said. Cal's going to yell at me for getting cut. Cal yells at everyone who gets cut. It's how he processes. Reno almost smiled. Not quite, but the muscles in his face moved in that direction. And for a man who had spent the last 6 hours fighting, barricading, transmitting classified evidence, and taking a crowbar to the ribs, almost smiling was enough. Silas sat in the corner where he always sat, the far end of the table, back to the wall, sight lines to every door. He hadn't spoken since the fight. His hands were folded on the table in front of him, the knuckles swollen and dark with bruising. He stared at them with the detached curiosity of a man examining damage on someone else's body. Silas, Gideon said. The old Green Beret looked up. You okay? Silas considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. Not the automatic fine that people threw at each other to avoid real conversation. A genuine inventory. Body, mind, the space between them where trauma lived. No, Silas said. But I haven't been okay in 40 years. Tonight isn't going to change that. What will? Bringing him home, The words settled into the room like dust after an explosion. Gideon nodded. The understanding between them didn't need elaboration. It was the oldest promise in the Brotherhood. Older than the club, older than the patches, older than anything except the fundamental covenant between soldiers who had bled together. You don't leave a man behind. Not in the field, not in the ground, not in 7 years of silence that everybody else had learned to live with. Cal returned at 4:15 in the morning. He pulled Reno's truck into the destroyed garage bay and stepped out with the quiet efficiency of a man who had just driven 70 miles through storm-wrecked roads with a retired deputy, an elderly ranger, and an 11-year-old boy, and had deposited all 3 of them in a safe house with food, water, and locked doors before turning around and driving back without stopping. "They're secure," Cal said. He looked at Reno's arm. "Take off the gauze. Let me see." "It's not bad." "I'll decide what's not bad. That's literally my job." Reno unwrapped the gauze. The gash was clean but deep, 3 inches across the outer forearm, the edges separated enough to show pink tissue beneath. Cal examined it under the flashlight, cleaned it with antiseptic that made Reno hiss through his teeth, and closed it with butterfly strips because the medical kit didn't have suture material and the nearest hospital was 40 minutes away, and none of them were willing to sit in a waiting room tonight. "Owen?" Gideon asked while Cal worked it. "Asleep, finally. It took him 2 hours to let go. The kid wanted to stay awake until he knew everyone was safe. Hector had to sit beside the bed and hold his hand until his eyes closed." "His hand, the burned one." "I cleaned and redressed it at the safe house. 2nd degree on the palm. It'll scar. But it'll heal." "Donovan?" Sitting in the kitchen, staring at the wall. "I made him eat something. He managed half a sandwich and 2 cups of coffee. He asked me 3 times if his family was safe. I told him yes each time. By the 3rd time, I think he believed it." The sky was beginning to change. Not dawn, pre-dawn. The imperceptible shift from black to charcoal that told the body something was coming even before the eyes could see it. The stars that had appeared through the broken clouds were fading, yielding to a lighter darkness that carried the first suggestion of shape and depth. Deacon stood at the ruined garage door, looking out at the parking lot where the fight had taken place. The asphalt was littered with dropped tools, broken glass, tire tracks gouged into the wet surface by federal vehicles. A single baton lay in a puddle near the spot where Gideon had taken the first attacker down. It looked small, insignificant, the kind of object you'd walk past without noticing. "Reno," Deacon said without turning around. "The forensic team's heading to Black Ridge. When they excavate the dump sites, they're going to find him." "I know. I want to be there. They won't let us near the site. It's a federal crime scene now. I don't need to be at the site. I need to be on the mountain, somewhere close enough that when they bring him out, we can see it. He shouldn't come out of that ground without brothers nearby." Nobody argued. Nobody suggested it was impractical or emotional or premature, because in this room among these men, the distance between tactical reality and emotional necessity was measured in inches, not miles, and crossing it was not weakness. It was the entire point. They slept in shifts, 2 hours each. Gideon took the first watch, sitting at the table with a cup of cold coffee and Elias's badge in front of him, turning it over and over in his battered hands, while the pre-dawn light crept through the broken windows and slowly, painfully, turned the clubhouse from a battlefield into something that looked almost like a place where men had lived. At 7 in the morning, Gideon's phone rang. Agent Whitfield. "Mr. Cross, we've located the primary dump site. Excavation begins in 2 hours. I thought you should know, ground-penetrating radar is showing multiple anomalies consistent with subsurface burials. We're bringing in a full forensic anthropology team." "How many anomalies?" A pause. 7. 7. Gideon closed his eyes. 7 human beings, buried in a national forest by men who considered them collateral damage in a business operation. 7 families who had spent years not knowing. 7 names that would finally be spoken out loud. "We want to be on the mountain," Gideon said. Another pause, longer this time. "I can't grant you access to the crime scene." "We don't need access. We need proximity. There's a ridge overlook about half a mile southeast of the Firewatch Trail. We'll be there, out of the way. We just need to be there. Whitfield was quiet long enough that Gideon thought she'd hung up. Then she said, "I'll make sure no one moves you along." They rode out at 9. All 5 of them. Cal had returned from the safe house, leaving Owen, Hector, and Donovan under the protection of 2 federal marshals Whitfield had dispatched before dawn. The morning was cold and clear, the storm's violence replaced by a crystalline stillness that made every sound carry for miles. The engines echoed off the mountains as they climbed the fire road, the exhaust notes braiding together into a single sustained chord that rolled across the valleys like a signal. They parked at the ridge overlook, a natural clearing on a granite shelf that looked out over the vast green canopy of Black Ridge National Forest. From here, they could see the flash of emergency vehicles through the trees far below. White vans, equipment trucks, figures in protective suits moving through the undergrowth like ghosts. The systematic, methodical activity of a recovery operation that would take days, maybe weeks, to complete. They stood in a line at the edge of the overlook. 5 men. Leather cuts. The patches faded and road-worn. The insignia earned through years of riding and bleeding and burying their own and carrying each other through the kind of darkness that civilians measured in metaphors. And these men measured in actual nights spent with their eyes open and their hands shaking and their minds replaying things that would never fully stop replaying. "I was angry at him," Gideon said. The others looked at him. After he disappeared, I was angry. For months. I thought he'd walked away, left the Brotherhood, left me. I thought he decided we weren't worth staying for. His voice cracked on the edge of the last word, and he let it. Here, on this mountain, in front of these men, cracking was not weakness. It was the sound of something frozen finally breaking open. I spent 2 years hating him for leaving. And the whole time he was down there, in the ground, 50 feet from where I rode every October. Close enough that if I'd gotten off the bike and walked into the trees, I might have... He stopped, breathed, felt the cold air fill his lungs and push against the thing that had lived in his chest for 7 years, the compressed, calcified mass of unresolved grief that had shaped his every decision, every relationship, every late-night ride through empty streets. He didn't leave, Silas said quietly. He stayed. He stayed longer than any of us. He's been up here the whole time, holding on to that badge, waiting. The words weren't poetic. They weren't philosophical. They were the plain, unadorned truth spoken by a man who had spent 40 years learning that the most important things could only be said simply. Below them, the recovery teams worked, slowly, carefully, with the reverence that the work demanded. Each shovelful of earth removed with forensic precision, each layer documented, each discovery treated not as evidence first, but as a person first, someone who had a name, a life, people who missed them. At 11:30, Whitfield called again. "We've recovered remains from the first excavation site. I can't share details of an active investigation, but I want you to know the location matches Donovan's testimony, the site you identified. The one closest to where the boy found the badge." Gideon gripped the phone so hard the case creaked. "Is it him?" "We won't have positive identification for days. Forensic anthropology needs time, but..." She paused, chose her words. "The remains were found with fragments of a leather vest and a set of motorcycle keys." Gideon's knees buckled. Not dramatically, just a small give, a momentary failure of the mechanism that had been holding him upright through willpower alone. Deacon's hand was on his shoulder before he went down. Steady, heavy, the grip of a man who had caught falling brothers before and understood that sometimes the only thing you could do was keep them from hitting the ground. "We'll be here," Gideon said into the phone, "however long it takes." They stayed on the ridge until dark. Nobody suggested leaving. Nobody checked the time. They sat on the granite shelf and watched the lights of the recovery operation below as the sun tracked across the sky and eventually dropped behind the western peaks, painting everything in amber and rust and the deep blue that came before night. Cal made coffee on a portable stove he kept in his saddlebag, one of the many things he carried because the habit of being prepared for anything had never left him, and never would. The coffee was black and strong and tasted like campfire smoke and survival, and they drank it in silence as the stars reappeared above them. The same stars that had watched over this mountain through 7 years of buried truth and were now watching the truth come back into the light. 3 days later, the identification was confirmed. Elias Boone. The forensic report was clinical in its language. Dental records, skeletal measurements, estimated time of death consistent with the timeline of his disappearance. But the report also noted something that wasn't clinical at all. The remains had been found with the left hand closed. Not naturally positioned, deliberately closed, the fingers curled inward as if gripping something that was no longer there. The forensic anthropologist wrote that the positioning was consistent with a cadaveric spasm, a rare phenomenon that occurs when muscles lock in their final position at the moment of death, preserving the last intentional act of a living body. Elias had been holding the badge when he died. They had pried it from his grip, just as Galloway had said, and even in death, his hand remembered. The memorial ride was scheduled for the following Saturday. Word spread through the Brotherhood's network the way word always spread: phone calls, texts, the invisible web of connections that linked motorcycle communities across the country in ways that outsiders never saw and insiders never had to explain. You sent the word out, and the word traveled, and people came. 312 riders arrived. They gathered in the parking lot of the Iron Vultures clubhouse at dawn. The roll-up door had been replaced. Deacon had overseen the work himself, spending 2 days with a welding torch and sheet metal, not because the club couldn't afford a contractor, but because some things needed to be rebuilt by the hands that defended them. The new door was heavier than the old one, stronger. It bore the scars of its making, weld lines visible, hammer marks along the edges, imperfections that Deacon left intentionally because perfection was a lie, and these walls had never pretended otherwise. Owen was there. He stood beside Gideon's motorcycle in the early light, wearing a new flannel shirt that Cal's wife had bought for him and a pair of boots that actually fit. His right hand was healing. The burn scar across his palm was pink and tight, the new skin forming with the stubborn resilience of a body that hadn't learned yet that some wounds were supposed to slow you down. His backpack hung from one shoulder, lighter now, emptied of the burden he'd carried out of the fog 3 weeks ago. Hector stood behind him. The old ranger had aged in the days since the raid, the lines in his face deeper, the stoop in his shoulders more pronounced, but his eyes were different. Clearer. The haunted vigilance that had defined his existence for years had been replaced by something steadier. Not peace. Hector Mercer would probably never know peace in the way that word was commonly understood. But the constant, grinding anxiety of living on a mountain full of buried secrets had been lifted, and in its absence he stood straighter than Gideon had ever seen him stand. Donovan was not there. He was in federal custody, not as a prisoner but as a protected witness, housed in a facility whose location was known only to the prosecutors building the case against Galloway's network. His testimony had already resulted in the arrest of Neil Fenton, 4 employees of Ridgeline Resource Management, and 2 county officials whose names Gideon hadn't recognized, but whose roles in the operation Donovan had described in devastating detail. The case would take years to prosecute. The evidence would fill rooms. And at the center of it, playing on a loop in every courtroom and every newsroom and every congressional hearing that would eventually examine how an entire region's institutions had been captured by one man's corruption, would be 23 minutes of video showing a retired deputy with a bruised face and shaking hands telling the truth he'd been suffocating under for 7 years. The ride began at 7. 312 motorcycles rolling out of Millhaven in a formation that stretched for 2 miles. The sound was immense, not loud in the way that loud was usually measured, but deep, resonant, a sustained low-frequency vibration that traveled through the ground and the air and the bodies of every person who heard it. Windows rattled in the houses along the route. Dogs barked. People came out onto their porches and their front steps and stood in silence, watching the column pass with the instinctive understanding that this was not a parade or a demonstration, but a funeral procession for a man who had been missing for 7 years and was finally coming home. They climbed the mountain, the same road Gideon had ridden alone every October for 7 years. The same curves, the same frost heaves, the same stretches of crumbling blacktop where the guardrails had rusted out and the ravines dropped away into nothing. But today the road was not empty. Today, the road was filled with the sustained thunder of 300 machines carrying men and women who had come from as far as 600 miles away because a brother had been lost and found, and it was time to bring him back. Owen rode with Gideon. The boy sat behind him with his arms wrapped around Gideon's torso, not the desperate grip of a terrified passenger, but the steady hold of someone who had learned to trust the machine and the man operating it. The wind pressed against them both. The mountain air was cold and clean and sharp with pine resin and the mineral smell of exposed rock. Owen's face was turned to the side, watching the trees pass, watching the fog that clung to the lower valleys like a living thing reluctant to release its hold on the landscape. They reached the Black Ridge trailhead at 8:45. The formation slowed, engines dropping to idle, the collective rumble settling into a subsonic pulse that you felt in your ribs more than you heard with your ears. The clearing at the trailhead had been prepared. A simple wooden marker stood at the spot where Elise's motorcycle had been found 7 years ago. Not a headstone, not a monument, just a hand-carved post with his name and road name, and the dates that bookended a life measured not in years, but in the distance between the man he was and the truth he refused to abandon. Agent Whitfield had kept her word. A small federal contingent was present, not to oversee, not to manage, but to stand at a respectful distance and bear witness to a community honoring one of its own. Whitfield herself stood at the edge of the clearing in civilian clothes, her badge visible on her belt, her face carrying an expression that Gideon recognized, the look of a professional who had seen the machinery of justice operate thousands of times and had never fully reconciled its clinical methodology with the human devastation it was designed to address. Deacon dismounted first. He walked to the wooden marker and stood before it with his hands at his sides and his head bowed. 312 riders killed their engines simultaneously, the sound dying in a wave that rolled from the front of the formation to the back, leaving a silence so complete that the only audible sounds were wind in the pines and the distant call of a raven somewhere high above the ridge. He didn't make a speech. Deacon Hale had never been a man who believed that words could carry the weight of what needed to be said in moments like this. Instead, he removed his cut, folded it carefully, and set it on the ground at the base of the marker. Then he reached into the inner pocket and withdrew something Gideon hadn't seen before. A photograph, old, creased, worn at the corners from years of handling. He placed it against the marker, face out. 2 young men in desert camouflage. Dusty, sunburned, grinning with the reckless invincibility of soldiers who hadn't yet learned what the world could take from them. One of them was Elias Boone. Gideon walked forward. His knee made each step a negotiation between determination and pain, but he didn't limp. Not here. Not today. He carried the badge in both hands, Elias's badge, cleaned and restored, the iron vulture with spread wings gleaming in the morning light, the road name Ghost Rider legible once more after 7 years of burial. He knelt at the marker. The ground was soft from the storm. The same rain that had battered them 3 nights ago had soaked into this earth and made it give, the way earth gives when it's ready to release what it's been holding. He didn't speak to the crowd. He spoke to the marker, to the name carved in wood, to the man whose hand had held this badge at the moment of death and whose trust in a brother's loyalty had outlasted his own heartbeat by 7 years. "I'm sorry it took so long," Gideon said. His voice was barely above a whisper, but in the absolute silence of 300 people holding their breath, it carried to every ear. "I came every year. Same road, same date. And every year I rode back down without you. I didn't know you were waiting. I didn't know you'd left something for me to find." He placed the badge against the marker next to Deacon's photograph. The metal rested against the wood with a soft, final sound. "A kid found it, 11 years old. Walked out of the fog with your badge in his backpack because he understood something the rest of us took 7 years to figure out, that the truth doesn't stay buried, not forever. Not when someone brave enough decides to dig." He pressed his palm against the badge one last time, felt the hammer marks Elias had made, the imperfections, the weight. You said someone you trusted would come looking. His voice broke. He let it. I came, brother. I'm here, and you're coming home. He stood, turned, faced 312 riders standing in silence beside their machines, their faces weathered, their eyes wet, their bodies carrying the accumulated damage of lives lived outside the margins of a society that had never fully understood them and had never fully needed to. Because understanding was not a prerequisite for respect, and respect was not a prerequisite for love and love. The real kind, the kind forged in foxholes and garages and long rides through empty nights, did not require explanation. Deacon stepped forward and placed his hand on Gideon's shoulder. Cal moved to his other side. Silas stood behind him. Reno flanked Silas. 5 men. A circle that had held through combat, through loss, through 7 years of unanswered silence, through a 3-day war against an enemy with institutional power and unlimited resources. The circle had bent. It had never broken. Owen stood at the edge of the clearing, watching. His grandfather's hand rested on his shoulder, not restraining, just present. The boy's face was calm. The fierce, wounded intensity that had defined his expression since the moment he walked out of the fog had softened into something quieter. Something that looked, if you knew where to look, like the beginning of peace. The riders started their engines. One by one at first, then in clusters, the sound building from a murmur to a rumble to a sustained roar that shook the trees and sent birds spiraling into the sky and filled the valley with a noise that was not noise at all, but a voice. The collective voice of a community speaking the only language it truly trusted. Not words, not speeches, not promises made in rooms with fluorescent lights and cold coffee. The language of machines and road and wind and the simple, indestructible act of showing up. They rode the memorial loop, down the mountain, through Millhaven, past the clubhouse, out along the county highway, and back up to the ridge. A circuit. A closing of the circle. Every mile a tribute to the man who had ridden these roads and fought for the truth they concealed and paid the highest price a man could pay for refusing to look away. Gideon rode at the front, Owen behind him, the boys' arms around his torso, the wind in their faces, the road ahead clear and open and winding through mountains that no longer held their secrets in silence. When the ride ended, back at the trailhead, Gideon parked his motorcycle beside the wooden marker and sat for a long time in the quiet that followed 300 engines going still. The afternoon sun slanted through the pines, turning the fog remnants gold. The air smelled of exhaust and pine and the clean mineral scent of mountains after rain. Cal brought him coffee from a thermos, black, strong. The cup was warm in his battered hands. Owen sat on the ground beside him, cross-legged, his backpack in his lap. The boy didn't speak, when he didn't need to. The silence between them was not the silence of strangers, or the awkward silence of people who don't know what to say. It was the silence of 2 people who had walked through something together and come out the other side speaking a language that didn't require sound. "What happens now?" Owen asked eventually. Gideon looked at the boy, at the scar forming on his palm, at the eyes that had seen too much and understood too well and still, somehow, against every reasonable expectation, held the capacity for trust. "Now, the hard part," Gideon said. "That wasn't the hard part." A sound escaped Gideon's chest. Not quite a laugh, something adjacent to it. Something that hadn't existed in his body for a very long time and felt strange and unfamiliar and necessary. The hard part is what comes after. Rebuilding, healing, learning to live in the world where the thing you were afraid of has already happened and you survived it. He sipped the coffee. It was too hot and too bitter, and it was the best thing he'd ever tasted. "Your grandfather's cabin needs a new equipment shed. I know some guys who are pretty good with tools." Owen looked at him. A small smile, barely there, more intention than execution, crossed the boy's face. "Will you come back?" Owen asked. "To the mountain?" "Every year," Gideon said. "Same road, same date, but not alone anymore. Hector approached from the tree line where he'd been standing with Deacon, the two old men having a conversation that Gideon would never ask about and didn't need to. Whatever passed between a retired Marine and a retired Ranger on a mountain where the truth had finally surfaced was theirs alone. The old man stopped in front of Gideon and looked at him for a long time. Then he extended his hand, rough, calloused, trembling slightly with age and exhaustion and the residual adrenaline of a week that had dismantled everything he'd built his isolation around. Gideon took it. "Thank you," Hector said. 2 words, stripped of everything except what they meant. "He found us," Gideon said, nodding toward Owen. "We didn't find him. He walked out of the fog and handed us the truth. Everything that happened started with your grandson deciding that silence was wrong." Hector looked at Owen. The boy looked back. And in the space between a grandfather and the child he'd spent years trying to protect from the mountain's secrets, something shifted. Not dramatically, quietly. The way tectonic plates shift. Invisible on the surface, but redefining the landscape underneath. "Let's go home," Hector said to Owen. Owen stood up, brushed the pine needles from his jeans, shouldered his backpack. Then he turned to Gideon and did something that no one expected and everyone felt. He hugged him. Not the self-conscious, arm's-length embrace of a child performing a social ritual. A real hug. Arms around Gideon's waist, face pressed against his leather cut. The full-body commitment of a boy who had spent his entire life in isolation and had found, in the most unlikely place, and through the most dangerous circumstances, the thing that isolation had denied him. Connection. Gideon's arms came up, slowly, the way a man moves when he's holding something he's afraid to break. His hands rested on the boy's shoulders, and he held him there, in the mountain air, under the pines, beside the marker that bore a dead man's name, and for a moment the world was exactly as small and exactly as large as the space between two people who had found each other in the fog. The afternoon faded. The riders departed in small groups, engines firing, hands raised in the universal biker salute. Not a wave, not a greeting, but an acknowledgement. "I see you. I know what this cost, I'll remember." By evening, only the 5 iron vultures remained. They sat at the marker as the light turned gold, and then amber, and then the deep blue of mountain twilight. The fog began its nightly descent from the peaks, sliding down through the trees like something returning to a place it knew. But the fog was different now. It was just fog. Just water and cold air and the physics of atmospheric condensation. It held no secrets. It concealed no graves. It was simply the mountain doing what mountains had always done, breathing, changing, continuing. Gideon reached forward and touched the badge one last time. The iron was cold. The engraving pressed into his fingertips like braille, a message from a dead man, written in metal, read by touch. He stood, turned to his brothers. "Let's ride." 5 engines fired in the blue twilight. 5 machines rolled down the mountain road in formation, headlights cutting through the gathering fog, exhaust notes weaving together into the low, sustained chord that had been the soundtrack of their lives for decades. Behind them, the wooden marker stood alone in the clearing, the badge gleaming against the carved wood, catching the last light. The forest settled into silence. Not the silence of concealment, not the silence of fear or complicity, or the slow burial of truth under layers of time and indifference. The silence of completion. The mountain had given back what it took. The missing rider was no longer missing. And the truth that a brave man had hidden inside a hand-forged badge, the truth that had waited 7 years in the dark, patient, indestructible, holding on with the grip of a closed fist, had finally, irreversibly come home, PA.